and welcome to AI X Disinformation or AI into Disinformation, however you want to pronounce it. It's a series of 3 conversations today brought to you by LMU Munich, led by Professor Sahana Udupa and us here at boomlive.in. The order in which we're going to proceed is like this. First, Govindraj Ethiraj, the founder of Boom and editor of also of India Spend, will make a few short remarks, followed by Professor Udupa, who will talk about why we are here and to talk about these 3 topics. We will then have our first conversation, and that's going to be on the threat and promise of AI, featuring Elena Hickok, Jency Jacob, and Professor Ponnurangam Kumaraguru. That's going to be moderated by Professor Udupa. The second conversation is on AI and extreme speech with Maya Mirchandani and Anshuman Dasarathi. That will be moderated by Govindraj Ethiraj. And finally, with the last conversation is on AI and digital propaganda, featuring Alafia Zoyab, Shivam Shankar Singh, and Karen Rebello. This will be moderated by me, HR Venkatesh. Now, a quick note, you can ask your questions during those conversations in the Q&A box and not in the chat box. That is a request. And during each of these conversations, you can do that, and the moderator will take them. We will try to take every question that you ask, but it may not be possible. Sometimes we might just combine 1 or 2 questions. One last thing to say, of course, thank you so much for joining us on what we are sure is a busy weekday. We hope you are going to get as much out of this as we are getting. And so on that note, let's start. It's over to Govind.
Thank you so much, Venkatesh. Firstly, let me thank LMU Munich and Professor Sahana Udupa for partnering with us on this very important initiative. Professor Udupa, as you know, or if you don't, is a professor of media anthropology at LMU Munich and also a Joan Schoenstein Fellow at Harvard University. And she's been focusing on this issue for many years, much before many of us even thought of it, as an important issue to focus on. Boom, just to give you a quick background, is an initiative that focuses on fighting misinformation and fake news and also explaining issues, which in some ways have to be done simultaneously. And we work mostly on the physical side and depend really on classical journalism to establish facts or debunk myths, as it were. On the other hand, we also recognize the importance of technology in being a source of the problem in some ways, but also equally in being a solution. And that solution can only be pressed forward if we were to work with this community, all of you that has joined us today, to make this interactive and instructive on how to really use technology and artificial intelligence in specific to find the solutions to this larger challenge of disinformation and misinformation that we are all facing today across the world in many ways and hues and means. So that really is the objective of this exercise, is to come together as a community to find solutions, to evolve in as partners to finding the solution with the technology companies, with researchers, with experts like yourselves. On that note, thank you very much once again for joining in, and I do hope that you're able to give to this discussion as you're able to take away. And it's back to you, Venkatesh.
Thank you so much, Govind. Sahana, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Boom, Govindraj Ethiraj, for first proposing this idea of having a joint program, HR Venkatesh and the team for taking it forward and realizing this event. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you are.
Okay, wonderful. So let me begin with some comments on the topic of today's event. We all know that researchers, regulators, and civil society actors who are examining forms and consequences of online extreme speech are struck by the enormity of the challenge that faces us in addressing this problem. So what Govindraj so well expressed, I'm going to probably flourish it with some academic jargons, but basically we all are trying to tackle a problem of immense magnitude and severity, because we know that online speech acts can have tremendous impact upon lives, upon minds, and upon democratic systems. So when we say online extreme speech, we are referring to speech acts that stretch the boundaries of legitimate speech along the twin axes of truth, falsity, and civility, incivility. So we are talking about hateful or derogatory language, and also disinformation, which is as Waddell and Direction defined, when false information is knowingly shared to cause harm. And it also includes malinformation, when genuine information is shared to cause harm, to go by their own definition. And then we have misinformation, spreading false information without the intention or to cause harm. And of course, it's very difficult to track intentionalities, but one can look at the patterns of exchange and a keen understanding of user cultures in the broader political context to make these distinctions. Very often, answers to this enormous problem is framed in what Morozov critiques as technological solutionism. So this is a tendency to embrace digital technology as a tool for democracy and freedom. And when faced with a problem, the idea that this very technology can somehow rescue us from the mess. So it is not surprising that companies and governments are increasingly turning to artificial intelligence to detect, curate, and tackle problematic content. So AI deployment is expected to bring scalability, reduce costs, and decrease human discretion and emotional labor in the removal of objectionable content. And this is usually the justification of using AI. But if artificial intelligence is seen as a remedy, especially to address the scale and speed of disinformation and extreme speech online, what kind of accountable practices should we aim for? Should we feel optimistic about AI's potential, or are we trying to engage with something that has actually amplified the problem of disinformation? What exactly is the responsibility of AI-based technologies? And as Govindraj very well formulated this, how can journalists, fact-checkers, and academics bring their knowledge and experiences to bear on the development and deployment of AI to tackle disinformation and extreme speech? And these are some of the questions this half-day summit is hoping to take up and address. So we are fortunate to kickstart the summit with a terrific panel. Professor Ponurangam Kumaraguru, and fondly known as PK, is a professor of computer science. Thanks for joining us. He's at the International Institute of Information Technology, Hyderabad. Previously, he was at the Triple ITD. He's a visiting faculty at IIT Kanpur, and he's a TEDx speaker, distinguished speaker at the Association for Computing Machinery. PK received his PhD from the School of Computer Science at Carnegie Mellon University. He was listed in the world's top 2% scientists by Stanford University in November 2020. He serves on various boards and academic councils. He has co-authored research papers on privacy and security in online social media, cybersecurity, computational social science, social computing, data science for social good. He's also, beyond academic work, has been advising various government organizations and government committees. So a warm welcome and thank you. I know how busy you are. Thanks for accepting our invitation, PK.
Thanks, Sahana.
We have Illinois Hickok. She is also a consultant for our AI4Dignity project. She is an independent expert examining how technology and policy can impact and benefit society. She has contributed to international policy initiatives and has presented worldwide on issues of digital rights and emerging technology and the counterbalancing of governmental and individual interests and rights. So we always have these discussions around freedom of expression versus extreme speech. So when we co-author pieces, we have this tension going on, extremely productive tension, I must say. So she has developed research and written extensively on issues relating to privacy, cybersecurity, surveillance, intermediary liability, and artificial intelligence. So very warm welcome to you, Illinois.
Thanks, Sahana.
Okay, and Jency Jacob is the managing editor of Boom and has worked with some of the top television and print networks in India. Jency is also a regular speaker at various national and international conferences, highlighting the importance of fighting against misinformation and the media's role in countering them with credible and factual news stories. Before joining Boom, Jency was the senior editor at Business Standard, business correspondent at the national broadcaster Doordarshan, and has worked at NDTV and was bureau chief of Mumbai at CNN IBN. Thanks, Jency, for joining us.
Thanks, Anna.
Wonderful. So this is great because we have a great mix of expertise on this panel: journalism, academia, and policy. I think one can't probably look for a better panel than this to engage some of the key questions around artificial intelligence and disinformation. So let me first invite PK to comment on the very first question. Has AI amplified disinformation? And before we even tackle that, PK, it would help us if you could unpack AI for us, because there is just so much misunderstanding and hype around AI. And we know that Princeton professor Arvind Narayanan and others have been commenting that artificial intelligence is the new snake oil, right? Take it in small doses with a pinch of salt, I believe, and it is made in the hyperspace. So there is just so much of opacity around this technology. So what does it actually mean when we refer to artificial intelligence? And has it really amplified disinformation? PK, over to you.
Yeah, I think I'm guessing that all the panelists and all the participants have mobile devices with you. So I think simple examples could be like how much things have changed on the phone that we use, right? In terms of interacting with the phone, in terms of getting it, I mean, Alexas and everything, right? Today, if you see the technology has moved, and just to give you an academic sense also, right? Even computer science degrees, people have started thinking about, oh, let's just do only AI degree, right? Your undergraduate in AI and everything. So I think the technologies that we use has just changed the way that we interact with many things. I mean, I mean, the cars that we use 10, 15 years before today, the cars have so much of technology in it that it can decide, you can let the car decide many things, right? Tesla and others. And so I think I'll go back to the mobile phone, because it's more easier to understand, which is you interact with the phone, get your commands done. The phone understands what you're saying, or you can get your Alexa to play your music. So I think AI is all around us, I guess. Anything that we touch, any technology that we use today is, I don't see it here, but you can also think of such platforms in Zoom where transcription is going automatically. As we speak, there's also text written of what is being spoken. All of that is sort of say technology and AI-based solutions. Coming to what has happened in sort of, for us, the topic of disinformation and everything. I think the simplest thing that I thought of mentioning about what is it, creation of the disinformation has just become so easier today. Meaning, if I were to think about graph of sort of say x-axis being years and y-axis being some skills to create this disinformation, over a period of time, the skills needed for creating this information, which is compelling, which is influential, which is getting viral, all that has become pretty simple, right? It's easy for anybody to pick up tools to create today, like a voice of PK speaking, like an email that what PK writes, or a social media post that PK does. So I think that's what is so the derivative of creation of these disinformation, and of course the reach of this also. The second side is, one is it's easy to make, the other side is easy to reach hundreds and thousands of people, again because of our social media platforms, because of our WhatsApp usage, all that, right? Derivative of reaching 100,000 people today is not at all hard with the content that we generate, which is probably extremely hard. Let's take 15 years before or 10 years before. So 2 points. One is it's easy to create and easy to reach people.
Thank you. Just to probe this AI a little more, when we talk about artificial intelligence, what kind of intelligence are we talking about? I mean, what can it do to human communication as a foundational, fundamental aspect of being human?
Yeah, so I think communication. If participants are looking for some pointers, social dilemma. If you look at right, it just gives you how much today the power of social, particularly the decision of what do I like, right? What gets my attention today? These are choices that AI can do today, right? The Insta post that I'm looking at, that the few fraction of seconds that I spend more on one post is giving information about, okay, I may be interested in either the post or I may be interested in the person who's posting. So these recommendation systems are so powerful for providing content that I like, and therefore I think they're getting hooked. They're getting me hooked onto these platforms, which is allowing them to get to know information about me, which can be used later. I think there's so much to talk about in terms of how the devices, how the platforms that we're using is actually making profiles of us. So the Great Hack documentary and the Social Dilemma documentary, I think both will give a great insights on how these technologies have penetrated the decisions that we make and also the way we think, I guess. Many of these platforms know more than what we think we know about ourselves.
Thank you. I think I will pick these questions, very important points you raised about algorithmic profiling and recommendation systems. And I think that's the perfect topic to invite Illinois, because she's been working on corporate responsibility. So Illinois, from your policy perspective, especially in terms of corporate responsibility and algorithmic sorting, algorithmic profiling, and we all know that these are not just impacting privacy, which is a very important concern, but also affecting vulnerable communities in very specific ways. So from a policy angle, Illinois, how would you comment on AI use, and is that amplifying the conditions for disinformation and extreme speech? Illinois.
So I think in terms of how these systems are built and how AI is used in a recommendation system, which parameters it is used in a targeting system, can most certainly amplify disinformation. For example, if we're using a parameter of what type of content is getting the most attention, then most certainly it can amplify harmful content, disinformation, etc. So I think when we look at how policy and policymakers are trying to respond to that potentiality and that, an actuality that it is amplifying disinformation, you see a number of different measures around corporate accountability being put in place. For example, the proposed Digital Services Act is requiring that companies disclose the parameters by which content is targeted by. That end users have the ability to choose the type of parameters that they're being targeted by, that this information is disclosed in transparency reports, that when automation is used in content moderation decisions, this is also disclosed in transparency reports. So I think generally speaking, there is an increasing awareness around the accountability that companies need to be held to when they develop and they use these systems that recommend and target forms of content.
Mm-hmm. And what about the implementation side? Because we are talking about Digital Services Act, which is pretty rigorous when it comes to outlining the responsibilities of global corporations. And they've also made the distinction, as we know, between very large social media companies and with very severe obligations, and vis-a-vis smaller social media platforms, and also all the policy directives that you outlined so well, Elinai. But when it comes to other countries, right? I mean, are we seeing the same rigor in policy making? Are we also holding companies accountable for AI amplified disinformation in other countries, especially in India?
So I think when you look at how AI has been incorporated into particularly the recent Indian intermediary liability guidelines that have come out, I mean, it's really actually used in a proactive monitoring function where the intermediaries are encouraged to use automated technologies to flag and remove harmful or illegal content. So I think, you know, when you look at this question of AI and content moderation, you can look at it from a number of different angles. One being using AI to flag and detect content, and then also AI as a means to, or how AI is used to amplify content.
Yeah, we will get to both the sides, the good side of its use in detecting, and it's probably the dark side of it where it also begins to amplify. We'll get to the good side of it very quickly, but before we do that, we will invite Jency to comment on these two perspectives, especially from your own grounded understanding of how disinformation flows into online conversations and how they become part of online discussions and messaging services, of course. So when you look at the actual ways in which online extreme speech and disinformation gets produced and distributed, etc., where do you see the role of artificial intelligence? Is that even a relevant question in the way you are fighting disinformation and misinformation in India?
Well, Sana, you know, there was a time when there was always this question that will machines replace, you know, humans in the factories? Robots will replace human beings. You know, that more and more automation will happen. You will not require human beings to do this job. And this is a question that over the last 5 years, you know, a lot of fact-checking conferences have spent time on this. You know, there will always be one session where a question will be asked, would human fact checkers be needed at all, the way technology is advancing? And that's a very valid question to ask. But I often find that the point of reference from where this question is being asked is completely misplaced, or probably not in the right frame. You know, people who are bad actors, or those who are part of ideologically driven you know, companies and ideologically driven narratives, or probably people who are part of IT cells, of political IT cells, they have been using technology far better than probably all of us who claim to be on the good side are even attempting to think how we can do it. And it's not as if you know, disinformation has not been spreading, narratives have not been spreading. Clearly, when you go back and look at political campaigns, both in the US and India, it's a decade old. Nearly 10 years back, political campaigns, maybe for good narratives as well, they had discovered that social media can be galvanized and can be brought together common narratives and political narratives that a political party wants to push forward. They've been using you know, all the recommendation algorithms and how to use the engagements, that likes and retweets and all of that have been used pretty well by them through automated systems. So it's not as if they have not been doing this at all. So we've always been seeing bad actors or people who probably want to push forward a narrative or an ideology using this over a long period of time, which is why we see particular hate directed against certain communities. We may say, oh, but you know, it may not always be targeted. You know, a bunch of people decided to become polarized, and then they decided to go online and voice their views. Maybe 15 years back, there was no online medium for them to voice their views. They were sitting in their houses, or probably sitting at the road corners and talking over a cup of chai and discussing these things, but now it's moved online. Yes, that's one side of the argument, but it is not as if that there are not that we did not have a set of people who discovered that this can be used to bring together people to believe in a certain ideology and a certain narrative. So that has been happening over a long period of time. But I still feel that we need to concentrate and on how we can use this for the good. If I don't know whether I'm jumping one question ahead, but as a fact checker, as an editor who's running a newsroom, we are always looking for opportunities on how to automate a large portion of the work that we are already doing. Sometimes, which we call donkey's work, because we are still looking at the same stuff that we were doing 2 to 3 years back, looking at the same content which is coming in. Sometimes, we get frustrated because something that we've debunked 2 years back is still now making a comeback through a small change in the text or a small change in the image or a small change in the video, which ideally we should not be looking at all. We should have had systems in place where automatically a lot of this is getting debunked and being pushed out to the users. Though a part of it, I am very proud to say that we are already doing through the WhatsApp tip line, where a lot of the content that we have already debunked, if someone is again asking the same claim, sending us the same claim, and they want to know, the bot is picking up the story from our database and sending it back to them. So there is a good side to it, and I think which we should concentrate more and more, because the bad actors will continue to do what they are doing. It is time for us to figure out how to automate a lot of our processes and use AI to reach out to a larger audience.
Thank you, Jansi, and very important points there. And let me focus on the point you made about linguistic innovations, right? What they do is these are culturally coded expressions. Over a period of time, we see that hate speakers and people who spread disinformation might not be using explicitly hateful language. They have coded words, for instance, peaceful for the Muslim minority community, or in the neo-Nazi context in Germany, for instance. There is an expression called Goldstücke, which means gold pieces. It's a sarcastic term for refugees. And a left-leaning politician, he went about describing refugees as opportunities to enhance wealth for the country. And that's how he describes it, as Goldstücke, right? Or opportunities to enhance collective prosperity. But then it so happened that the right-wing groups started appropriating that term, and they made that a sarcastic term, and they used that as a coded term to exchange messages against refugees. So I'm giving two different examples, one from the India context and one from the German context, only to tell us that this is an extremely complicated linguistic phenomenon. So now let me bring PK to comment on what can AI do, even if our intentions are very good, even if we were to work with AI technologies with the best of our energies, how can machine learning models detect culturally coded hateful expressions, constantly shifting and mutating forms of language? So how can machine learning help us to do this, detect this?
Yeah. First, I think a disclaimer that machines are not going to do this in a very near future. Let's start from there, right? I think it's going to be very hard to. I think some kind of things that you hinted, but I can also push it a little bit. Sarcasm detection. All of this has been like a long-standing problem where we don't really understand the language as well. But I think what we can do, I think early Jansi also mentioned that they have implementation, they have technologies that are sort of say doing this. I think more of interactions between either the academia and the industry should happen, and the more of these resources have to be generated. I find it really hard for when I finish, I'll actually post one or two pointers that we actually spent some time recently on creating regional language sort of say data set of fake news, right? I mean, Boom may have it, but people cannot build technologies with the data that Boom has, right? So there needs to be more of sort of say these data sets to be created, more of challenges. No, I think we saw Netflix doing a challenge on saying that, oh, come build a recommendation system. Here is a challenge. I think we should have a large challenge. It's not like the hackathon. The hackathon has a slightly a shorter attention span, it looks like. But a grand challenge type of a question saying, look, here is a challenge. Come solve the problem. All of us, it's a mass collaboration idea, right? Get more and more people to get involved in solving the problem. I think Gen Z and Boom and others are trying to do it in one direction, right? Which is, oh, let's all curate a data set of all the misinformation that is floating around, all fake news that are floating, all that. So, but then this has to be used for something else also. You have to help use this data to build technologies that are on top of it, which I think is not happening today. I see papers being written academically, and I see Gen Z kind of people attacking it with sort of say human annotation and physical resources. But I think rarely they all speak together. No, I think more of this to be done, given the caveat that technology is not going to go reach and solve the problem, but we can make progress. I think that progress we should be able to make, because it looks really, really important for first to create resources which can actually help understand the problem. Today, I don't even know. So you said, right, mutate. I don't even know the mutation that happens today. Right. So how do you, I mean, if as a human being, if as a sort of a user of these platforms or technologies, I can't find it myself, what can an AI technology or a platform do?
Absolutely. This is a very critical point. Jensen has raised his hand, so let me invite him to comment quickly. Yeah.
Yeah. So PK has raised a very important point here. 3 years back, if someone would have asked us that, okay, you're doing fact checking, so what next? What else can you do to help this ecosystem of fighting misinformation or disinformation? Honestly, I wouldn't have had a very clear answer. But since then, there are a lot of researchers who have got in touch with us. Many of us have sometimes gone and filed joint proposals for grants to look at, to do larger research in this area. And it's something that we are very conscious about, that we are fact checkers, we are journalists. We don't really probably have the expertise to build tools around it, though we are always looking for people to come and join us and work with us to do that. What we can provide as a newsroom is the ability to look beyond just a claim being true or false. There are so many nuances to it, like the linguistic nuances that are there. Sometimes what may seem for the machine, sometimes if we laugh at this, we see something going viral on social media, and the algorithm picks up something and and decides to either say that it is not true, or they punish it, and then they later on realize that similar matching is not working, because they have gone and picked up one of our fact checks, and they have gone and tried to similarly match it with another content which is in another language, and completely messed it up. And then we have to intervene and speak to the platforms and say that this has been wrongly tagged. So there are these issues. And this is something that only fact checkers who probably are doing this on a day in and day out basis and understand the nuance of how certain claims go viral and how there are certain other languages where that claim may mean something else. This is the kind of expertise we bring in, but we don't necessarily have the skills in terms of research or the ability to build tools on the top of it. But we can definitely work with researchers and experts who can work on this. So it's an open call through this forum. Anyone who's anyone who wants the expertise of a newsroom, Boom is always available. Please get in touch with us, and we are willing to walk that extra mile to build tools over and above the data and the database that we have.
Absolutely. Jency, I think this is also, I'm going to seize this opportunity also to flag our own collaboration between Boom and AI4Dignity. It is a project which envisions close collaboration between fact checkers, AI developers, and ethnographers. So sometimes we've noticed that even AI developers, they might be very good at computing, but the social side of this is sometimes missing. So I'm just putting it mildly. And similarly, social scientists, ethnographers might have a very good understanding, a very deep contextualized understanding, but might not have the technical skills to build and intervene in machine learning models. So, and on the other hand, of course, Boom and other fact checkers have tremendous knowledge of how this field is evolving. So to bring these communities together is clearly what AI4Dignity is trying to do. So we are hoping that this will be picked up. And Jency, we are so excited that many more researchers are also approaching you. You both highlighted a point about resources, which is very critical, right? And PK, I share his enthusiasm when it comes to inviting more and more people, but I'm also aware that crowdsourcing cannot be the answer for this, because crowdsourcing actually frames this entire responsibility and pushes it to a very undefined entity called crowd and away from corporate responsibility. So the real question is, who should be paying for this? And who should be covering for this enormous, gigantic effort of bringing communities together, hybrid models and machine learning models that can also incorporate human annotations, etc. So let me bring in Illinois there. What do you think about the imbalance in the resources and who should be responsible for sponsoring or supporting this entire initiative?
Definitely the companies. No, I mean, I think it's interesting, right? When you think about the ecosystem of stakeholders in this equation of content moderation and using AI in content moderation, and how it can be developed, who has access to the resources. And of course, the resource question can be broken down in a number of ways: access to the data, access to the infrastructure, access to the ability to test the tool. So there's a lot of different ways to break down that question. I think there are some interesting initiatives to look at. So for example, there's a lot of policy movement around companies opening up data for research purposes. And again, you find that in the Digital Services Act, there's movement in the US around legislation in terms of opening data up to to researchers for research into disinformation, et cetera. So it could be interesting to see if there is a way to push that discourse into opening up data that would be useful for developing these models. There's also work going on around this idea of democratization of AI tools, which perhaps lessons could be drawn from. I do think that it is easy to say the companies have the most resources, so they should be fully responsible. But I think you also need governments, policymakers to help set a framework for how that development might happen, or those resources might be distributed. And then again, I think when you look at how collaboration can be facilitated, there are also a number of questions about which experts are you bringing to the table? How are you evaluating different types of inputs, conflicting inputs? So I think this idea of collaboration is really important, but there's also a lot of really nitty-gritty questions to work out in the details.
Thank you, Illinois. I think you always bring this very keen attention to different details involved in collaboration, because collaboration itself is such a grand term, right? We all have to think about collaborating, but what are the policy parameters that define this collaboration? And more important, how can we also engage corporate accountability questions with greater clarity? And I think you brought up these three different points, which are very interesting: access to data, and access to the ability to test the tool, right? And also the parameters of collaboration itself. So, but I would also like to highlight one other aspect. Of course, Elnoy, you and I have worked on this, on a tremendous imbalance in resource allocation, right? We know that from the most recent reports from the New York Times, 87% of the company's global budget for time spent on classifying misinformation is earmarked for the United States, while only 13% is set aside for the rest of the world, even though North American users make up only 10% of the social network's daily active users. I end quote. This is from the New York Times report. So in the news article, of course, the company spokesperson was quoted defending their position, and they claimed that these figures are incomplete because they don't include the company's third-party fact-checking partners, most of whom are outside of United States. But the very lack of transparency around the allocation of resources and the outsourced arrangements around third-party partners signal what I call severely skewed structures of content moderation that global social media corporations have instituted. So when we talk about it, Eleanor, you have a point. Can you unmute yourself, please?
Yeah. I mean, I would just completely agree with you, Sahan. And I think that you see different countries trying to respond to this and being frustrated with it. For example, like having national legislation in Germany saying, you know, these social media companies need to have and demonstrate that they have moderators that work in the German language. And so it's definitely a frustration. And I think governments are trying to tackle it at a national level, but there are questions about, you know, is there a responsibility within corporates to take this on? And I think in some ways it might be interesting if you look at the tool of like a human rights impact assessment, and how when companies undertake a human rights impact assessment to understand how their services are impacting different geographies globally, this question of resources will automatically come up. And I think human rights impact assessments is something that companies are increasingly looking to and taking on. So it could be, you know, when you look at your different tools and places where levers can be pushed, that could be another interesting area to push for a more equal distribution of resources.
Absolutely. So now, with that, I mean, let us imagine a situation where resources are available. So this is a hypothetical situation, but even with the availability of resources, now we can probably end this discussion by highlighting some areas of opportunity for automation in disinformation detection, and perhaps also countering it by reducing the momentum of the flow of disinformation and extreme speech. So there are two questions here, Jency and PK, both of you, if you could comment. What are the opportunities for engaging AI-related technologies in disinformation detection? And number two, how do we even, aside from detecting, how can we include issues like distribution, etc., in this conversation? Jency, may I invite you to comment on that?
Yeah, Sana, that's, like I said earlier, a lot of the work that we do, which are very low value, can actually be taken away from us, and probably something which is a tool can easily do that, and we only look at the most important stories of the day. That way we prioritize, and we also turn around on stories. Like, there are certain stories where you will have to speak to a law enforcement officer, you may have to speak to a political party, or you may have to speak to someone who's the primary source, because we don't rely so much on secondary sources at all, unless in very rare situations. So a bulk of that work where you don't need any source verification where you don't need to speak to anyone, but can only be looked at, whether if there is an image, if is there an original image which is going even much beyond before that, or if there is a video, has it been spliced? Is there a full video available? A lot of this work can be automated. So that's there on the newsroom operational part of the work. The other side, as far as the platforms are concerned, I still feel that they're not doing enough, because a lot of the stories that we claims that we are debunking, we keep finding them coming back again and again. And if platforms are multi-billion-dollar platforms, who really have a lot of resources, the best talent that they get from Silicon Valley, from the best Ivy League colleges who are working with them, doing a lot of the engineering work, why is it that they probably are not able to at least reduce the same claims that we've been seeing over the years? At least that should be taken off from our plate, and we should not be looking at all those old claims and the old texts and the old videos, again and again. If they are able to remove that, I feel at least 50% of the content that fact checkers, not just in India but around the world, are looking at again and again, we may not need to look at it once more. So if that can be done and platforms can do it, I don't know whether it's an issue of talent, or it's an issue of expertise, or whether it's an issue of will, or whether they really want to do it, because a lot of the engagement that they get may reduce, and I don't know what impact it has on the business side of it. But yes, definitely platforms can do that.
Absolutely. And I think you're so right that the industry attracts the best of the talent. And then I see him smiling at that point, because we all train people and then they just get appointed by big giants. Picking on a couple of points that Jensi mentioned, that day-to-day routine forms of detecting disinformation could be automated. So that is one part. And the second part is also how older forms of disinformation do not reappear. So that seems like a very easy proposition, at least technically. So how do you see, from a technology perspective, are these possible, feasible, and what new opportunities do you see for automation in this field?
Yeah, first let me react to the smile, right? The smile I was giving because when Jensi was speaking about it, so actually all of these big companies have my contemporaries in my PhD, in my grad school, sitting there and doing all of this. They're all extremely smart people. They know, they understand the problem, everything. But here is the catch. I think, Jensi, the catch is that I feel, this is again my take of from the technology and my own sort of say experience in a different field called phishing, where again the same problems were going on, the same old phishing emails like 40 years before, right? This Nigerian email saying that, oh, we have $2 million, send us some 10 lakhs rupees and we'll give you 2% of it, all that. That's still successful, no? There are people in India still falling for it. We have taught them so many times. So I think the catch is, one, the people itself. I think it's a human behavior of falling for some of these things. Two, I think there is why I think technology and the best of the best people are not able to address this problem. They can address it. I think they're also trying to address it, if I were to put it that way, but they actually don't know what all to solve, because there are small changes in the same article that's showing up. I build a technology. To answer Sana's question directly, can technology be built? Yes, it can be built. It can be built to identify whatever Jensi said, 50% can be removed. It is possible. But the problem is that the input that is coming is actually small variations of the same things, which technologies today don't understand to figure it out, right? Image being spliced in different ways, the quality reduced, the quality increased, all that today technology is not able to do as much as it should do. I think that's where the catch is, where I find that these technology companies also are struggling to, meaning I think building technology is actually easy. I'll put a pointer, 2 pointers again to another pointer where technology can be built in this hate speech and this disinformation finding, but a small variation, Jensi, somewhere, right? Change the image, right? And it will not detect, or something, image is same, the text is different. We've kind of understood all these problems, but I don't know whether enough, and this is only talking in English. Just imagine, just leave the English and talk about regional languages. It's a whole different problem. No, we don't even understand the problem yet in regional languages. We don't know how to take a Hindi sentence and understand what is being spoken and all that. So I think the magnitude is big. Technology can address it. I think more and more of efforts towards understanding this problem is necessary, I think.
Thank you. I think we also have several questions, and some of these questions have, I think the panel has also addressed, but it's interesting that all of us are thinking similarly. Anmol, for instance, Anmol Alfonso, he raised the question about AI recognizing hate speech, which changes every moment from one event to another on social media. So that's something that we have been looking into in this panel as well. Thanks, Anmol, for that question. So I'm also trying to see if there are other questions. So there is another question which is, okay, which is directed at Illinois. So Ginny Parmar asked if she could put some light on bias of companies and brands when it comes to allotment of funding, fact-checking resources. So I think we touched on that when we talked about disparities, but is there any other point you would like to add, Elina?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
So, oh, the question disappeared. Basically, the discrepancy in resource allocation, corporate resource allocation for fact-checking services. So do you see bias in corporate allocation of resources?
I mean, I think there is, kind of obvious biases in terms of perhaps more resources going towards English language content. In terms of like specific like geographic biases or like specific numbers, I don't have like specific information about that.
Mm-hmm. But the broader point about how, I just cited New York Times report, but there are just so many different reports now to highlight the fact that resources are not allocated evenly. And there are two other questions. One is about small variations. Again, I think everybody is worried about how linguistic expressions keep changing. And at the same time, the question is, after machine detection is possible for very similar cases, can we then pass it on to a human fact checker to verify further? Jency, any quick comment on that?
Well, I'm not sure whether we have that process yet. Sometime back, we were trying to work with some researchers to figure out how a lot of the data sets or a lot of the claims that are coming on Twitter can be looked at by a bot and pick up the stories from our resources where we have already debunked a lot of them, or some similar story that we have debunked, and send it out to the users, and then forward only the more complicated or the new versions of it to us. We worked with someone on that, but we were not able to come up with a foolproof mechanism for it. But it is definitely possible.
Yeah.
Why is it not possible? I think it can be done. It is just that we don't have the expertise to do it, but definitely we feel that there are people who probably are trained by you, Sahana, and by PK, who would be sitting in platforms and are looking at various other sets of problems. But I'm sure that they can definitely find, or they can write codes which can easily look at content like this.
Yeah. I think my piece there is Jansi and Sana, that should be possible. No, I think it is just the intent of working together and addressing this problem. Because I think we understand. AI automation is all about that, right? Large chunk. Can you take the millions of tweets and give me the whatever is very relevant, so that the human fact checkers or human annotators can look at a small sample rather than hundreds of thousands of tweets that is coming in. Absolutely possible.
Mm-hmm. I think let us end this discussion with a very sort of ethical question to PK and others as well. I mean, what do you think is the role of academics and civil society actors to push for this AI for good in terms of disinformation research and disinformation related activism. So how do we even deal with big corporations? And how do we also deal with repressive regimes and actions that might not always be supportive of free expression, etc. So there are, as I see, two big challenges. One is commercial social media. I think one of the participants has also flagged that. I'm just rephrasing that concern. The concern is how corporate media are mobilizing their resources to monetize engagement more and more. And that's the reality. On the other hand, we also see cozy relationships between political parties and social media companies. And there is this huge breed of political consultants. And we have a panel later on. So this is the sort of nexus that we are facing today. So as civil society activists, fact checkers are definitely part of this independent civil society, if we may say so, and academia, we consider ourselves as independent, etc. So where do we actually see ourselves maneuvering in this extremely restrictive kind of space? PK, any thoughts on that? And then we'll end the panel.
No, I think as academicians, I think what are we good at, right? We're good at two pieces. One is to educate people, educate the next generation of people who will work on these technologies. Meaning, if you just think about it, right? How many institutes taught ethics for engineers like 5 years before? Today, we have institutes talking about AI and ethics, transparency, FATML, right? Fairness, accountability, transparency, all have come into mainstream computer science training programs, right? So therefore, I think that's one good thing that we can do. What does this, then the next step is now that we get students to, for example, I'm teaching this semester, I'll also put that link to, I'm teaching this semester a course called Computational Social Science. Right. So I think I was earlier also you mentioned, I was smiling at that time saying, oh, engineering, computer science people sometimes don't understand social science. I think that we don't understand it at all as computer science people. We just don't understand what happens in, so to say, psychology of human beings, social scientists, how do they think all that? So I think such kind of programs should come. Education should happen. And the next is, when you do this, automatically you will start looking at students addressing new problems, new research questions, technologies being built. They will start being part of solutions which are more ethical and all that. So that's what academicians are good at. I think we need to do that more. We need to get more and more people join the bandwagon of saying, look, let's build AI for good technologies.
Wonderful. I think this is a great optimistic note with which we are going to close this first panel, and I will then hand it over to Govindraj and Venkatesh for the next panel. Thank you. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Sahana.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sahana. And that was a very, very insightful conversation. And in some ways, you've laid the ground and brought us up to date on some of the key challenges that we are facing when it comes to trying to solve the problem of disinformation and the role of technology in either accelerating it or potentially solving it, and the need for partnership to do that, even as we try and understand it better. So let me welcome the next panel. The panel focuses on AI and extreme speech. And we have three colleagues, Eleanor Hickok, who's an independent expert examining how technology and policy can impact and benefit society. She is a policy consultant with the University of Artes and the AI4Dignity project at LMU Munich, our partners for this event as well. She was earlier a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Chief Operating Officer for the Center for Internet and Society in India. Also welcoming Maya Mirchandani, an Assistant Professor of Broadcast Journalism and Media Studies at Ashoka University. For nearly 3 decades, she was a practicing journalist with NDTV, reporting on foreign policy, conflict, and national politics. She's won the prestigious Ramnath Goenka Award for Excellence in Journalism twice, the Red Ink Award for reporting on human rights, as well as the Exchange for Media Broadcast Journalism Award for Best International Affairs Reporting. And finally, Anshuman Dasarathi, Research Assistant at IT for Change. His work seeks to understand online life and its offline effects. He works on projects related to platform governance, intermediary liability, and gender. And he has an undergraduate degree in law from Jindal Global Law School and a master's degree in sociology from Delhi University. And he's also worked on ethnographic research on cinema as a traveling medium and digital media consumption practices in non-metros. Many of these worlds actually converge, sometimes for the good and sometimes not. So on that note, let's kick off our discussion. We've talked about AI and extreme speech. Let's try and understand 3 or 4 things as we launch into this discussion. One is how bad is it, and how does it? How do we respond to it as a problem? Is it something that we see as localized? Is it something that we see as something large and meriting much more response than perhaps we are offering today? Secondly, what's the impact of this? And maybe that's where Anshuman's work also plays out, which is that where does the offline meet the online meet the offline? One of the things that we've seen is that in some recent instances is that the perpetrators of hate speech, particularly online, are maybe young, maybe do not fully understand the import of what they're doing online and its ability to have a potential impact offline. And do they understand anything? And given the fact that of the maybe 600 million, and I'm talking about India, internet users today, 300 million have come online only in the last 4 or 5 years. Now, this is a segment which in many ways is uneducated. And when I mean uneducated, I don't mean in terms of degrees, but in terms of what digital literacy and digital impact is. So just to give that little benefit of doubt, do many of the people who are perpetrators of hate speech, are they aware of what they're doing? And something that could have been or remained only in the realm of a private domain, when it becomes so easily accessible to public domain, obviously has a lot more impact than people think. Now, does not make it any less dangerous, but this is something to think about, at least from a research point of view. Finally, how do we solve for this? There is a supply problem, which is people who are generating hate speech either in an organizational way or individually, and there is a demand side, people who consume it. How do you address the problem on both sides? And that applies to disinformation in general as well. So we'll talk about all of that. I'm going to ask each of our speakers to speak for 3 or 4 minutes, just to talk about this theme on AI and extreme speech from their point of view. When we say AI, we really mean technology and how technology amplifies extreme speech to societal detriment. And I really urge you to speak for 4 or 5 minutes, or 3 or 4 minutes as you speak, and then following which we can go into a conversation. So can I request Illinois to go first, and Maya, and then Anshuman. And thank you all for joining us today, most importantly.
Thanks, Govindraj. And I think in terms of how AI can amplify extreme speech, we touched upon that in the last panel, in terms of how content can be recommended or targeted to different users and amplified across a service, across platforms, across an information ecosystem, and the role AI can play in that spread and amplification of disinformation. How AI can be used to create disinformation through something like deep fakes. I think there's also the side of how AI can be used to detect extreme speech. And perhaps for this panel, I'll focus a little bit more on just different policy initiatives that we looked at in the AI4Dignity project that looked to AI as a tool to counter harmful content and as a solution to harmful content online. And I think it's interesting because when we kind of dug a little bit deeper into different policy proposals that were looking at AI as a solution, different configurations of use emerged. And in some ways, this was touched upon a little bit in the last panel of, okay, is AI used to flag extreme speech that then goes to a human reviewer to take a final call, or does AI automate the solution? Automate the decision completely? Some interesting configurations and policy trends that we've seen has been different recommendations that AI is used to demote the ranking of content that exposes users to problematic content, to prioritize relevant, authentic, and accurate information, to identify, review, and reduce illegal content, and to redirect users from problematic content, and then also to promote counter narratives. I think some other things that we saw when we looked a little bit closer at different policy frameworks that are coming out that recommend the use of automated technology is that there are at least kind of, 6 different regulatory elements that are being focused on right now. That includes the mandatory nature of AI as a tool to counter extreme speech. So should governments be mandating companies to use it? Should they be recommending that companies use it? I think principles to guide the use of the use of the technology. So does the use need to be proportionate, respect privacy, the type of content that it is used to detect? So is it used to detect child abuse content? Or is it used in a more nuanced situation of say, bullying speech? So the type of content that it is used to detect. Then again, instances of human AI collaboration. So is it recommending and then human reviewers are taking the final decision, or is it fully automating that process? Transparency requirements, so requirements that companies be transparent about their use of AI, different safeguards and risk assessments and review. So it's interesting to see as AI is being used as a tool to counter extreme speech, some of these different regulatory elements that are emerging alongside of it.
Thank you, Illinois. Maya, it's over to you.
Thanks a lot. Thank you to Sahana for having invited me to speak at this, and to everyone at LMU at Boom Live for organizing this wonderful session. I'm not a computer scientist, so I don't want to really speak to the technicalities of how this works. I thought it might be perhaps more useful for the audience if I were to try and elaborate or sort of explain the frameworks around which the definitions of extremism and extreme speech are being understood by some of these companies. And I think, it's one thing to talk about technology and the amplification of extreme speech through technology by bots or whatever have you. It's another thing to actually have these tech companies decide or identify for the public what this kind of speech entails. And I think the big controversy right now exists in that space, which is, how do we define what is extreme speech? How do we define what is hate speech? Is Twitter and Facebook's definition enough for people sitting not in the US geography or not in the US political or social context? And one of the challenges that people like me who've been looking at the impact of hate speech online in the real world deal with constantly is the I don't know whether it's inability or unwillingness of certain tech platforms to actually appreciate the context specific nature of some of this speech. So they would have to do this, or we would all have to do this, firstly by sort of identifying what kind of target groups are we looking at that are at the receiving end of this kind of speech. Whether it is caste politics or misogyny in the Indian context, or religious politics and communalism, there are different kinds of targets and different kinds of contexts in which this speech operates. People like me have been looking at Islamophobic hate speech regularly, in the political context, in the context of extremism, in the context of countering violent extremism, which is sort of a UN goal. And the argument we've been making time and time again is that if you're looking in a national security framework, if you're looking in a, tackling terrorism kind of framework, you need to ask yourself what are the drivers. And when we see a rising trend towards Islamophobic hate speech, can we please address that as a driver of extremism, as a driver of radicalization, as much as it is a manifestation of radicalization? So I think there's a sort of twofold approach that needs to be taken when we look at this, because again, I come back to context, I come back to local, regional, national contexts before we get to an international context. And we have seen, by framing it like this, a slight increase, and I don't have, this is all anecdotal for me, but a slight increase in their willingness to listen. When I say that if you do not take down Islamophobic hate speech on your platform, and that Islamophobic hate speech in turn is going to act as a driver of radicalization, they are far more likely to listen. It's upsetting, but this is the reality. In sort of the post-Trump era of American politics, and the renaming of Facebook, and sort of reorienting Twitter at its top management levels, etc., there is this language of weaponized social movements that tech companies are talking about. They called them, there was a term for it specifically. I suggested weaponized social movements. They have another term for it. But the point is, they are looking at extreme ideological, hate-filled movements that are not Islamic. So I said, basically, you want to define everything which is not Islamist violence, not as terrorism. And there is this sort of connotative nuance between terrorism and extremism when it's used at the global and at the political, at the diplomatic level. I don't know if you've paid attention to even today's newspapers, but the Indian permanent representative of the UN actually made a speech saying that we have to talk about Hindu phobia and anti-Buddhist violence and anti-Sikh violence. And there is a great push by the Indian diplomatic community to ensure that the right-wing extremism nomenclature is restricted to white supremacist neo-Nazi frameworks and doesn't extend beyond that. Whereas some of us are saying you need to expand that definition. You need to look at right-wing religious extremism in India. You need to look at right-wing religious extremism in Myanmar also as extremists. So, again, when I come back to the question of AI and tackling extremism, I think the question I have is for tech companies when they're devising their machine learning tools to understand what is the vocabulary of extreme speech. How do they factor in the context? How do they factor in the political and the social context? And I think, without some kind of human intervention, even at that level, a machine is only going to do so much and no further. And I think that's where the really big gap is. I'm going to stop there. I don't know how much time I've taken, but I have no answers. These are all questions that I keep asking. So if somebody else has answers, I'd be happy to hear them.
Thanks for that, Maya. I think the questions are very important, and I think this is about posing questions in a research context, and expanding the definition, as you've said. It's not about, you mentioned the government taking a certain position, and that's a position that must be also brought on the table, as would be the position that you pointed out, and that's what gives inputs to researchers and the technologists to come back with holistic solutions on addressing in this context hate speech. So, Anshuman, it's over to you.
Thanks. Good afternoon.
You're on mute.
Oh, am I still on mute? Hello?
Yeah, go ahead.
You hear me, right?
You're a little soft.
Oh, hello. Better
Yeah,
now?
that's better.
Okay. Yeah, so first of all, thanks to Boom Live and AI4Dignity for inviting me. I'll be presenting some of the findings from our forthcoming research study on hateful and abusive speech on Twitter directed at 20 women in public political life. And I think there's considerable overlap between what Maya said and what I am planning to say in these introductory remarks, in that I will also be emphasizing the question of definition and how we frame the issue. Uh, but just briefly, in terms of methodology, we use the method of purposive sampling to select women who are both formally involved in party politics, as well as political commentators who are engaged in public life, such as journalists and voices of civil society. The endeavor was to create a representative sample across the axes of caste, age, and geography, and also along the ideological spectrum. And we used the Twitter API provided by the developer platform to collect data from their public profiles. And we developed a set of annotation guidelines to code these into 22 mutually exclusive hate speech codes. So coming to the question of definitions and basically diagnosing the problem, and Govind, what you had said about like understanding precisely how bad it is. A central claim that we put forward is that in order to grasp the magnitude of the problem of gender-based violence on social media, there is a need to destabilize and unsettle the concept of violence, of online violence, especially with respect to trolling, which is often considered supposedly a milder form of violence. Professor Udupa's writings on Gali were influential in developing this perspective. So violence against women in the form of online trolling has become normalized to such an extent that it has been rendered almost invisible and imperceptible. We argue that there is a tremendous amount at stake in the very act of naming or marking out the boundaries of such violence, and in so doing, recognizing the structural harms of online gender-based violence beyond just causing mental anguish or offense, but in legitimating the discriminatory treatment of women in the online public sphere. By drawing attention to this wide range of behaviors that ought to be recognized as gendered violence, and this is a key point regarding regulation, which I guess we'll come to soon. But we argue that the principal issue is not necessarily the content of hateful speech or its policing, but rather the platformized structures which enable such speech to thrive and spread virally. Uh, the affordances of social media platforms tacitly encourage and reward behavior that is abusive and toxic. And although widely condemned by platforms as deviant behavior, trolling fits comfortably in the contemporary media landscape and is a culturally sanctioned and endorsed form of online behavior. In keeping with our focus on everyday forms of violence, we have adopted a decidedly ordinary starting point in our study of online violence. This approach has helped us bring into sharper relief the immense amount of online violence that is of a supposedly milder variety, which derives its toxicity and potency from its volume and frequency rather than based on its locutionary content alone. Um, I could go into the findings now, or I could stop here for now.
Thanks, Anshuman. I mean, you could provide some of the findings. Maybe that would also help. Bring up and debate some of the points.
Yeah, sure. So I guess the broadest level finding from our research is that all women in the sample, regardless of their political affiliations, received some amount of abuse on the platform. There was nobody who was entirely spared. This disabused us of the notion that all trolls are right-wing users. However, having said that, women from opposition parties, those who are perceived to be left-leaning and dissenters, received a disproportionate amount of abusive and hateful messages. Muslim women and women political commentators, that is, who are not formally involved in party politics, were especially at the receiving end of an inordinate amount of abuse. Another perhaps counterintuitive finding has to do with the most common kinds of gendered abusive speech on the platform. While we did certainly come across things like rape and death threats and other speech acts of similarly grave nature, far more common were forms of trolling in the nature of tongue-in-cheek jokes and remarks. We found this fun culture of vitriol and abuse to be rampant on the platform through the sharing of misogynistic memes and wordplay. Another highly generalizable pattern we found had to do with how trolls collectively targeted particular users and posts, perhaps partly as a way of establishing some kind of fraternal solidarity, and partly related to what Jency was saying about how the bad faith actors seem to have a better grip on the social media dynamics than we do. Perhaps partly as a way to exploit the system of algorithmic amplification, we found the prevalence of this kind of herd aggression, where users banded together to reply to only certain posts. We also found that abusive speech received by women in politics rarely had anything to do with their work or with their political positions. Rather than responding to or engaging with these political positions, trolls invariably resorted to either questioning women's credentials or trivializing their role in politics, basically insinuating that they were just there to make up the numbers. I'll stop there.
Cool. Thanks very much for that, Anshuman. So I think a couple of things from our discussion's point of view. You talked about algorithmic amplification, and we'll come to that and spend some time, because as we talk about what the response should be, there are two parts of the problem. One is that someone is doing it, and the second is the amplification, which is why it becomes a big issue. So let me talk about the first part. And Maya, let me come to you. So the internet is a strange place, right? It obviously gives voice to people who otherwise may not be heard, or are from a personality point of view sometimes quite different from the way they come out, and this could be for the good and the bad. So why is it that we are seeing so much of this, and is what we are seeing offline today, particularly in the context of attacks on women, is it a pure reflection of the society we live in and our treatment of women or our regard for women, or is there some distortion which is sort of getting amplified on the online side?
Okay, so I mean, that's a complicated question, and I think it goes also into a little bit of behavioral studies. So yes, it is a reflection of who we are, in terms of the people who behave in a certain way, but I think we are working with technologies that thrive on bringing out certain elements of personality in a way that is provocative. So if I'm provoked, my instinct is to respond and defend myself. So you're already pushing somebody towards a sort of position, a binary position or a position, which could be the opposite of what has been said. And the platform will then, or the algorithm will find a way to fuel that conversation in which in a manner where the divide becomes sharper. It has taken, I think, years. Look, I mean, I left active journalism in 2017, right? I left NDTV in 2017. My first project was to work on the impact of counter speech. And I very quickly realized counter speech sort of is premised on the assumption that you reach out to a person's sensibilities and they will see the wisdom of their ways and do a course correction. Then you realize it wasn't working. Why are counter speech measures not working? Counter speech measures are not working partly because we're all married to our devices, and our device is telling us there's no need for counter speech. So who are we trying to present ourselves to in that manner? I mean, I tell my students, irrespective of what class I'm teaching, if there is something you will not say to someone's face, try not to say it online. But it's a mental leap to kind of ensure you maintain that sort of sanctity of communication. Typically, because you are isolated, you are, you know, within the bubble of yourself and your device with nobody watching you, you're also emboldened to be something that you may not be in front of other people. So it is behavioral, but the technology, I think, uses it to the advantage of sort of fueling. And I'm not even going into things like bots and, you know, forget
Right.
even like extreme speech. I look, my 13-year-old niece was pushed offline because she was attacked for her skin color and her weight and whatever have you. This is teen bullying online, and they are driven by the number of likes and the number of, you know, shares and whatever else metric that they're using on whatever platforms that they are. So yes, it is. I mean, I think it's a combination. You can't separate one from the other.
Right. Okay. And Eleanor, let me come to you now. I think so. Let's continue on the gender example that has been tabled here, and since that's a real and active one, so tell us about how does AI then understand this, or how could AI then understand and respond to this? I mean, that there is an offline problem. The behavioral characteristics that we are dealing with are quite unique. These are not people who would have otherwise had such a let's say a prominent voice in the offline world, but they have a prominent voice in the online world. Technology in turns amplifies that and then creates the impact that it has, and that's why we're all here. So how does one begin to address it from 2 points? One is from a technology and platform point in your understanding, and second is a policy point.
So, I mean, I think it is complicated. I think there are different approaches companies have taken to try to address something like online gender violence or disinformation or hate speech. For example, bringing friction into a system. We've seen this on a number of different platforms, for example, WhatsApp. And this is not AI per se, but WhatsApp limiting the number of messages that can be forwarded, deprioritizing different types of content, trying to put different kinds of requirements on accounts depending on how many followers they have, companies trying to think through, is there a difference if the speech is coming from a politician or a prominent public figure versus an ordinary user? So there are a number of different interventions that are being explored by companies and the research community. I think when I look at this and I look at the different steps being taken, something that stands out to me is that we still need a lot of data on how effective these different initiatives have been. And that speaks to the point of, you know, the importance of developing these initiatives with the idea of metrics and measurement from the beginning. And that can help us understand what is not working, what is working, and how potentially we could course correct, or we could add more nuance to the different initiatives. I think something that really stood out to me from what you were saying was just that there needs to be a lot of focus on how companies are deploying these technologies and how they are creating the policies and the frameworks for which they're operating in, right? The importance of multi-stakeholder engagement with the end users throughout the course of a policy as it lives. Like, it's not that companies write a content moderation policy and it's done. They're constantly updating it, and that those constant updates need to happen, with multi-stakeholder engagement and input from experts and impacted users. I think the question of how do you incorporate context is really important and really interesting. How do you capture an information ecosystem and how information travels across the ecosystem, and where's trust between actors, and why is information shared a certain way, or what does that content mean in a certain context, etc. And translating that and perhaps giving a framework for companies to work with could be really, really interesting. And again, mechanisms like notice or like an appeals mechanism also become really important to think about.
Okay, so some of this, or maybe a lot of this, is work in progress. We can see some things being attempted, but maybe a lot of it is not working. Maya and Anshuman, platforms do have an appeal process. What's your sense in terms of their effectiveness today?
Anshuman, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. It doesn't look good, especially I can speak from the context of online gender-based violence. In addition to the problem of detection, there's which as I tried to lay out before, which is complicated all the more by the fact that online gender-based violence takes so many forms. So it's not easy to identify it based on its semantic content alone. But like the kicker is that the SSMI compliance reports under the new IT rules also shows that across at least for both Facebook and Twitter, the policy areas where they receive among the most user complaints, user grievances, is in the policy area of abuse and harassment. And I remember for Twitter, it's they only take action against around 1/6 of those complaints. And additionally, going back to the task of detection, abuse and harassment is, I believe, around 50% on Facebook in proactive detection using AI proactive monitoring tools, compared to other policy areas which are all in the
Right.
90s and above.
Right. Maya, before I come to you, Anshuman, when you say abuse and harassment, is this individual harassment, someone going after someone for a particular reason, or is it usually tinted with either politics or some prior position on some issue and so on?
No, it's individual in the sense it's filed by individual users to the platform through their grievance redressal mechanisms. Obviously, there would be patterns where some women are targeted more, as Maya has spoken about, and our research also bears out.
Right. Go ahead, Maya.
Yeah, no, I was actually just had a very short answer to this, which is I don't think that they get to the problem quickly enough. When something is reported, their sort of internal process of verification and getting back to you, it's so long, and more often than not you will find that the sort of response has been that the platform doesn't see it in quite the same way, because again I come back to the original point that their definitions of what comprises hate or extreme speech are so broad and so vague that there is room for interpretation unless there is a direct, specific, violent threat that is being made that is identifiable to even a 5-year-old. So when you're removing context and you are keeping the vocabulary so vague, how are you going to be able to address any of this? I mean, that's the real question. You know,
Right.
that I
So,
have. Yeah.
yeah, and it's a very important question, perhaps one of the most important questions, because the technology response is one part of it, and
Yeah.
we are constantly coming back to it. But the non-technology response is what, in some ways, determines whether we want to do something about this.
Yeah, so if I can just sort of digress for a moment, because in my opening
Yeah.
remarks, I couldn't remember the term that they were giving this sort of new aspect of hate and extreme speech and sort of extremism and radicalization. They're calling it militarized social movements. So, the definition is that they have to be militias, they have to be trained, they have to have access to ammunition, and they have to have an extreme ideology. So, again, I'm saying that all those criteria fit the traditional definitions of what defines terrorism anyway. So, what are we segregating here? And how are we segregating it? Do sticks and stones that mobs use come under the definition of arms training? Because the act of violence, which is ideological, is an act of extremism. And again, we're losing out because I think either we leave things too vague or we want to segregate too much, and there's no happy medium. That it's been years, like I said, 5 years, 6 years, and I've still not found anyone who says, all right, we can agree that this is a problem.
Right. Okay, so let's take a couple of questions and comments as well. Siddharth Narayan says to Illinois, if engagement of users is the basis of the business model of platforms, how much can we expect them to act on countering virality of hate speech? So therefore, even if I think the question implicit point here is that even if the technology were to exist, implementing it would run counter to the business model. Not a new question, but it's worth revisiting every time.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question and a great point. And there's a lot of discussion that the business model of social media companies, this idea of the attention economy, needs to change. And and that needs to change not just within companies, but shareholders, and there needs to be buy-in from the board. RDR Ranking Digital Rights has done a great report, which is called "It's the Business Model." I can share the link to it, but it's a great point. It's really hard to say, or it's really easy to say, oh well, just change your parameters. But that's how the platforms are functioning right now.
Right. Okay. And we'll come back to what we think are solutions, at least in the context that we can propose them. Joel Samuel says, and Maya, maybe you can respond on this. How does one define hate or extreme speech when hate for one is love for another? For example, I love my country, therefore I hate those who hate my country narrative. The same goes for religious narratives. My religion is better than your narratives.
That's the whole point. Why does it have to be either or? And I mean, this is $1 million question. I would really be a millionaire if I had the answer to it. In its broadest definition, hate is, I guess, defined as sort of discrimination against somebody else for values that they may or may not share with you. It's really how one platform says we recognize violent speech, a direct threat to violence, a direct threat of violence, a direct targeting of someone, discriminating against someone based on their gender, their class, their religion, their caste, their sexual identity, whatever have you. Those are sort of very clearly understood, but there's lots of grays in the middle of that. So as Anshuman is saying, and the work they did, when you're looking at misogyny, for example, you're looking at anti-women speech, right? In whether it's, women should not work, women should be in the home, women should wear certain kinds of clothes, whatever it may be, behave in a certain way. When you now narrow that down to either sort of Dalit women, you're combining anti-caste speech with misogyny. If you're looking at Muslim women, you're combining anti-Muslim or Islamophobic speech with. So, I mean, there are multiple contexts and multiple permutations and combinations that just fall between the cracks of these definitions. I honestly don't have an answer. Not just me. I don't think the United Nations has an answer on how they haven't been able to define terrorism in all their years of functioning. Hate speech is, it's
Right.
your version of what it is versus mine.
And the question really is, how can the machine learn this better, if not
Exactly.
respond faster?
And so my question really would be, why should it be that if I love my country, I hate yours? I can be indifferent, no?
Okay. Right. Joel, that's your answer. But Joel has another point, and this let me pose to Illinois. He says definition of hate speech equals freedom of speech for another. If according to law, an act of violence can be looked at as murder or self-defense, depending on the perspective of the event, how does the same machine, and this is the moot point here, how does the same machine learn both sides of the narrative and decide for us?
Well, I think the question is, should the machine be deciding for us?
At all.
And that, I mean,
Okay, Eleanor is frozen for a moment, but while she comes back, Anshuman, do you want to respond to that? How can we train the machine better? Because I mean, today's conference or is in the context of technology. So how do we train a machine to not just learn both sides, but also the nuances, the many very, very critical nuances that Maya mentioned, which of course are evolving, but this is what we know even today.
I don't have an answer directly to that question, but on the freedom of expression point, I think platform policies are largely animated by American legal frames of legitimacy, out of which the freedom of speech and expression is considered paramount.
Yeah.
But I mean, if we take a collective view, a kind of ecological view of the media landscape, freedom of, how can we advance a more communitarian ethic of freedom of expression, that our freedoms are connected? So, I mean, I wouldn't, I'm trying to challenge that equivalence of freedom of speech equals hate speech for the other. Yeah.
If I can also just add, I think even in the US, actually, even in the US, where the First Amendment is paramount, I mean, within law enforcement, within the political spectrum, there is a realization and a recognition that while the First Amendment is paramount and needs to be protected, there are certain definitions of what constitute discrimination and hate speech that are punitive, that you can take punitive action against, that can be legislated against. So I think there is a little discomfort about the manipulation of the First Amendment by the haters, and it's a debate. I mean, I don't see the Americans ever sort of rewinding or walking back on the First Amendment, and that's a good thing. But I do see, certainly in sort of bigger cities like New York or Chicago or DC or San Francisco, where you have multi-religious, multi-ethnic, multi-racial populations, where law enforcement is grappling with this on a daily basis, where it may be the First Amendment, you may be protected by the First Amendment, but what you've said is actually targeting someone else. So I think, coming back to what Illinois had said earlier, the approach for platforms and for tech companies has to be one that is not just driven by the bottom line, because the bottom line will drive virality, but it is something where you have scholars, researchers, people, citizens groups actually, that are part of the multi-stakeholder process.
Right. Illinois, do you want to come back? We lost you for a bit, but I think the question was really, how do you make the machine learn better?
So, I mean, how do you make the machine learn better? I think what the AI4Dignity project is trying to explore is this incorporation of multiple stakeholders and their expertise and perspective. So can you can you explore collaborative models of development to see if you can make a more rich and effective AI solution?
So let me use a question and then add to that. So Mukesh Jadhav asks, can AI resources and facilities be owned, manipulated, used, and dominated by only the most wealthy and most powerful identities and companies, or can it also be used and manipulated by a common person? So I guess the embedded question in that is, are the rich in some ways, rich and powerful in some ways, controlling everything that we see for whatever business objectives, profit objectives, hate for profit, which we see in many other platforms, not just digital platforms? Or can it also be used and manipulated by a common person? Is it truly democratic in a very bizarre sense? Go ahead, Eleanor. That question is for you.
Oh, okay, that question is for me. I mean, it's an interesting question, right? Is the ability to spread disinformation and manipulate others equally available to everybody? I mean, I guess technically you can use a platform and accumulate users in certain ways, but I do think that if you have resources, companies, run campaigns for politicians, et cetera, that most certainly means that it can be bought and captured by certain segments and individuals, and political parties, et cetera, in power.
Okay. Maya, do you want to come back on this thing? So we're going to head for a closure in about 10 minutes. But, there are 3 or 4 points that we've focused on. We focused on the people side. We focused on the fact that even on the people side, it's a very evolutionary process. And there are nuances. There are nuances with country. There are nuances with language. And there are nuances with every developing situation. I mean, what was, let's say, important 1 year ago may not be today, and vice versa. And finally, what is the role of platforms in this? 2 parts, I think, which are very clear. One is that they have to respond faster. And their definitions of what is, let's say, harmful, for instance, needs to be sensitive to things that are happening around. It cannot be an old definition. It cannot be defined by the First Amendment, as you mentioned. The second is to be preemptive, which is always it's almost the holy grail in everything we do, including in fighting disinformation. Right. How much can you preempt? How much can you actually stop or at least slow down even as it's happening or as it just happens? So technically that's possible, but obviously because of many other reasons, it can't be done. So let me get a couple of points, and I'll try and bring back Sahana as well for an input on this. So even as we look ahead, and we attack the problem of extreme speech, how can AI-assisted models or better understanding of AI solutions driven by research help in solving the problem? So, Anshuman, do you want to go first, and then we can? I'm going to come back to Sana at the end.
Yeah, sure. So, like you said, I mean, there's so many factors at play here. So it's this might be a bit of a mishmash of an answer, but one part of the story is the whole echo chamber and filter bubble thing, where people, I mean, as the affordances of social media platforms encourages a kind of narrowness of moral vision, and the goals of public discourse are simplified to they're instrumentalized towards achieving some goal. So that ends up manifesting in terms of like public discourse ends up becoming a scoring system, where if you have more likes, that means your message is better, because it gets seen by more and more people. So maybe one way that AI could or technology more broadly could be harnessed to better things is, like I mentioned briefly, that it shouldn't be used only to for the process of detection and like, for example, image detection to see if something contains some sort of offensive graphic imagery or something like that, but also like to and I guess, like, I'm not there. I believe there's literature to suggest that things like retweet cascades can be predicted with some degree of accuracy ahead of time. Um, so in that vein, AI could be used to look at not content only substantively in terms of semantic content, but also in a more contextual manner in terms of
Right,
dissemination.
and if I may quickly supplement a question to that, Anshuman. So the study that you did, and you looked at the women who were attacked. What could have changed if, let's say, there was more responsive technology or more responsive AI? To what extent could this have been mitigated?
Yeah, I mean, what we saw was that the trolls didn't employ any kind of sophisticated methods to harass women. I mean, it was as simple as if a woman tweeted something, there'd be an offensive reply. And then in a long list going down, the people would just retweet that same offensive reply. So, I mean, I don't know how to formulate this in technical language, but there has to be a way to, like,
Sure.
weed out this kind of inauthentic behavior, or it has to be developed at least. Yeah.
Sure. Okay. Thanks for that, Maya.
So, from the perspective of somebody working on the links between extreme speech and extremism, I think there is a line between the two, and both merit attention. It might be easier to look at extremism because the assumption is that it's organized, it's got a leadership, it's got an ideology. You can trace things back to a particular starting point or a catalyst and work backwards from there. But the truth is that even extremism, much like extreme speech, has become very diffuse. I could be sitting here posting something, and somebody in Europe could pick up my post and say, I like the way Maya thinks, and you create your own network. So this idea of the echo chamber is not people who know each other. It may not even be it may not even be all automated. It may be actually people who are seeking each other out based on a particular kind of ideological political position. What we have seen, and what we have unfortunately seen actually, is the tendency of tech platforms to kind of fall into line with the politics of the day. And I think the change will really start from there. Can we insulate platform development and AI development from politics? Before we even get to the technological aspects, I think that's the question that companies have to ask themselves. Because if they do that, then we can at least start the process. But I think we have enough evidence in the last few years of the pressure or the proclivity that tech platforms have to fall into line with the politics of today. And I think I would say that let's start from there.
Got it. Okay, that's an important point. Eleanor, can I also use a question and then seek your sum up here? The question is from Sandeep Khurana. He says, do you think an oversight board to look into complaints against content moderation have the desired governance structure to elicit trust, and how can they be made more effective? Is political and commercial will lacking for meaningful platform governance, and how to overcome that? After which I'll go to Sahana.
Thanks, Govindraj. And actually, maybe just to start, you said that companies should be responsive, preemptive. I would just also add to that they should be transparent about policies they have in place, technologies that they are using, how they are using them, when they are using them. how effective those technologies are, because in some ways it can be like when we talk about it from the outside, it's a bit of a black box, and that means that sometimes the evidence we talk about is, and the research we do, is one-sided, or it's scattered case studies that researchers are able to develop. So just that transparency is also really important. And I think in terms of the question of the oversight board, so I think and I'm assuming that's referring to the Facebook oversight board that was in place. So I mean, I think that is an interesting mechanism for trying to establish and think through some of these more difficult questions, and establish precedent and find a mechanism to input into company policy. At the same time, I think there are still a lot of questions around which cases get selected, how the company actually takes on oversight, the oversight board's recommendations. I think it could be interesting also to think about the oversight board expanding to different services within the platform. But it's definitely an interesting step to try to build trust. And I think the question of company, I think it was around like motivation to take on these measures and political will. I mean, I think you need a mix of both. I think you are seeing increasing calls from companies for regulation and guidance from regulators in terms of what frameworks need to look like. I think at some level you're going to need coordination for social media regulation across borders, because you might end up with companies needing to adhere to frameworks from a number of different countries, which could get complicated very quickly.
And maybe that's perhaps the only inevitable solution. Sana, a quick word from you, and then we close, and I'll hand over to Venkatesh. If you were to look at now the broader theme, I mean, right, we started out by saying how can AI-assisted models help in detecting and moderating online extreme speech? We've heard the problem, the offline challenge, the online challenge, the challenge of online becoming offline, and also whether maybe we need to at least step up content moderation, even as we figure out how to be more preemptive. Some comments from you, and then we could close.
Thank you. It's such a great panel. Thank you, Maya, Elnoi, and Anshuman. Govindraj, there are no quick answers, clearly. But what we have been attempting in this event is to understand the place of technology in this very complex social problem, right? And more, we are beginning to realize that community-centric perspectives have to be incorporated in our imaginations of technology. So when we say community-centric perspectives, we are flagging different things here. And the very first point that Maya made about the definitional problem around extreme speech and hate speech, even if you prepare the best machine learning models, the definition of what constitutes hate speech and extreme speech would remain very vague, and it is up to us as communities to decide upon that. So that's first part. The second part where the community comes in is what Anshuman so wonderfully formulated, a communitarian ethic towards freedom of expression. So it's not really individualistic. So that's the second point. And the third point is more operational. The EU Digital Services Act, for instance, it emphasizes a category called trusted flaggers, right? And who are these trusted flaggers? It's a status that's given to entities, organizations, and not individuals that have demonstrated particular expertise and competence in tackling illegal content. And the moment trusted flaggers, they report something, then social media companies are obligated to act on them on priority. And now this trusted flagger system has to become more widespread and more rigorous. And that's where I think your initiatives, Govind Raj, Boom, and others will come into play. Because if this could be done and actually also scaled up, and so we cover the linguistic diversity of a country like India, and then create a whole network of trusted flaggers, so social media companies become obligated to respond to these reports on priority. And that's an agenda that I think we have to push forward. And now I will close this comment with another angle about community-centric perspectives around AI technology, which is the distribution logics. So far, we've been talking about detecting extreme speech, right? The semantics of it itself is very complicated, as Anshuman so well brought up. But even if you step out of it, when you look at the distribution logics of it, your mind is actually stunned by the creativity that is involved in distribution. And we all know how WhatsApp is hewn and hammered to create intrusive channels for inflamed rhetoric of different kinds. And you tend to trust this because you receive it from a trusted person. And I've been theorizing this in my latest work as deep extreme speech, right? And this works by tapping into kin or kin-based networks, right? Where a political party WhatsApp group begins to behave like a kin-like group. So you don't look at the veracity of the content, but because of the distribution logics. So this is the sort of difficulty we have, and I think I'll have to end here. I see that Venkatesh has been talking, or I don't know how it works.
No, not yet. No. I think we've run out of time. So Sana, thank you very much for coming in.
These are the 4 points that I think would be very important in understanding how a community-centric perspective would be important in understanding artificial intelligence in this field of disinformation.
And creating the framework of response. So Maya, Anshuman, and Eleanor, I think thank you all for, and finally Sana, for giving a 360-degree input into this very, very important issue, which obviously will go in and hopefully determine and drive how we actually respond on the technology front to this evolving and challenge and problem in the internet, because finally we need the internet, but we also need a safe internet. And on that note, I'm going to hand over to Venkatesh for the next discussion. Thank you, everyone, and it's over to you, Venkatesh.
Thanks so much, Govind. Thanks to Anshuman, Elena, Maya, and Sahana. That was me throat clearing, so it wasn't me talking. Well, it's time now to talk about AI and digital propaganda, and I have an equally exciting lineup. We have that's that on the screen right now. We have Alafia Zoeb, who is the advocacy director at Reset Tech. Their goal, in their own words, is to stop big tech companies from profiting off public harm by resetting the rules for online media. She has a decade of campaigning experience, first at Amnesty International and then at Avaz. She's previously worked as a reporter for NDTV in Chennai as well. We also have with us Shivam Shankar Singh. He's the co-author of The Art of Conjuring Alternate Realities. I'll show the book, it's right next to me when we come back on video. And this book, co-authored with Anand Venkatanarayanan, looks into how narratives are spun, spread, and sustained. He's also worked as a consultant for political parties, and he's also one of a bunch of people who are behind this IT bot on Twitter that's called Guru AI. So it spins out spiritual wisdom, but it's actually an AI bot. If you're interested, you should check it out. Finally, we have Karen Rebello. She's the deputy editor at Boom, where she's an investigative reporter, fact checker, and copy editor. Karen also tweets with droll humor. And, come to think of it, droll rhymes with troll. So Karen fights trolls as well, or knows how to put trolls in their place. So thanks so much, all of you, for joining us. This is a session on digital propaganda and AI. So for those of you, especially students who are not clear as to what propaganda is, how is it different from news, advertising, analysis, other forms of information that are out there? Let me just quickly say there are 5 characteristics of propaganda, more or less. You can quibble about how we've highlighted the number of points. One is it appeals to our insecurities and anxieties. So propaganda is usually designed with a clear purpose to get us to respond emotionally. That's one. Two, it can sometimes and many times often is indifferent to the truth or indifferent to facts. It can use any means to accomplish its ends. And propaganda, it aims to influence not just our attitudes, but also our behavior. And just to take that, number 5, it aims to influence large populations towards some type of cause or position or behavior. So that's really setting up what propaganda is. It's a very basic definition. And on that note, I'm going to ask my panelists to start with their opening remarks. Alafia, I'll start with you, especially given that your role asks you to hold big tech accountable. So how do these things intermingle? Propaganda. We've also just had a session on extreme speech, as you know, and AI.
Thanks, Venkatesh, and really good to be here and good to meet my fellow panelists. I'm going to start by, I'd like to actually situate the work that I do because disinformation and propaganda spreads across various media, mainstream media, cultural content, entertainment, etc., etc. So I just want to situate the work that we do at Reset. If you think of the life cycle of disinformation, the production, the distribution, and the consumption of disinformation, Reset is focused very heavily on the aspect of distribution, and particularly distribution on social media. And our theory of change is essentially the way the platforms are currently designed, which is maximized for growth. They have absolutely no incentive to change any of their policies or systems, and only regulation can make them do so. And so that's why we lobby very heavily for regulation. So having done this work for a few years now, there were a few points that I really wanted to highlight in this battle against disinformation and big tech. Disinformation as enabled by big tech, but obviously they're not the only perpetrators. So some of the points that I want to highlight are, one is, and I think Sahana touched upon this when she referred to like community-based interventions, the glut of research on disinformation tends to be currently very heavily from the Western world, from Europe, North America, and very heavily focused on English, which means that a lot of the interventions that we may be designing to tackle the problem are not actually global, and they may not actually fulfill needs of communities far away from the global north. So what we need is actually much greater scaled up research, linguistically diverse, driven by different communities that understand the dynamics of disinformation and propaganda as it is targeted to them. So I just really want to underscore the diversity point, because we can't design solutions if we haven't engaged those communities in the problem to begin with. And one example of that is, I think there has been an overemphasis on fact checking, and a lot of research also shows that, banish this idea that facts are the thing that are going to fight against disinformation because of this emotional appeal of some of these narratives. And so there are other ways to fight it. It is not just fact checking. But that brings me to the second point, which is, we don't actually have rigorous research on what are the interventions that actually work. So it's very hard to know at the consumption level what sort of intervention has worked within a community. How durable is it? Are the effects of media literacy programs really short-term? Are they long-term? So we need much more rigorous research on that aspect of the consumption of disinformation. The third point is something I touched on earlier, which is the absolute crisis in mainstream media and the way that tacks on to social media. So, for example, Fox News content goes crazy viral. Extreme content as disseminated from mainstream media has a double advantage on social media because the algorithms are primed to promote extreme speech. And you have this additional problem of slightly higher levels of trust in mainstream media anyway. And so therefore, the combination of the two, the social media algorithm plus disinformation emerging from mainstream media is a real crisis. And I think that's something we have to address more from potentially media regulation and media reform rather than social media reform. The other aspect of my work is to campaign on these issues. Basically, how do we make the problems of disinformation, the data extractive models of big tech, how do we make them matter to people? And there, I think we have a huge gap. All the research I've read and all the people I speak to, you talk to the average person, and to most people, this old Facebook talking point that the platforms are but a mirror of society is still a very dominantly held view. So the role of algorithms in changing our information ecosystem and our behavior from being just a mirror to actually a funhouse mirror, from being just a mirror to a megaphone, that aspect is still very invisible to most people. And we in the in the spaces where it's academics and researchers who work day in and day out on this problem, I think we're all still collectively slightly disconnected from the real world, where people still think there's a kind of seamless reflection of society on platforms. And the reason I emphasize that point so much is, okay, so what if people knew that wasn't the case? I think the problem we have is a crisis of hope as well, which is that if you think the reflection of society on social media is real, it leaves you hopeless. It leaves you gutted about the hate and the disinformation you encounter every day. So I think putting that in perspective, that actually this is an amplification of some of the worst voices in society, is a good starting point to literally just get back some hope that we can tackle the problem. And finally, again, I think Sahana referred to the Digital Services Act. We are sat here having this conversation on a morning when the European Parliament has just voted on the DSA. And the promise of regulation emerging from like a slightly more progressive space is that it can hopefully set a precedent for other parts of the world, as well as enable civil society in other parts of the world to demand the same things that platforms are forced to provide citizens in spaces where there is actually robust regulation. I may have gone slightly off script, so I'll stop here and then, look forward to robust Q&A discussion.
Yeah. There is no such thing as off script, because everything is an interesting thread that should be followed. And thanks for those 5 points. I'll try to paste them when I get a moment into the chat so that people who didn't get it can read it. There is a saying, right, Alafia, that once you reach rock bottom, there is no way but up. So the question is, I mean, it's a rhetorical question. Have we reached rock bottom? And I hope we have, but I suspect we haven't. On that note, Shivam, I want to bring you in for your introductory remarks. Wearing your several hats as a person who has consulted with political parties, as well as someone who has studied this from an academic perspective, and in your current role, where do you think we are right now as with respect to the use of AI tools? And we've seen recent investigations come to light as well about how political parties and the current administration in particular has access to many tools that perhaps we are not aware of. I'm referring, of course, to that tech fog investigation, which has been lauded, but also questions have been asked about that investigations, I should add. So are you aware, which is that question again, which is, have we reached rock bottom, or in the sense, is there more to come?
Thank you for having me over, Venkatesh. Extremely interesting topic and extremely relevant for all of us to talk about, considering the world that we live in. I'll actually start with a quick story of how I got into the space. As you mentioned, I started out working with political parties, working on election campaigns. If you look at the technology over there, what we did was mostly based around data analytics. What we did was profiling constituencies, profiling voters, putting them into different categories. After that, someone else took over that data and used it for messaging. And when you have voters profiled into different caste buckets, different religious buckets, different socioeconomic buckets, different age groups, It's much easier to craft a message that will resonate with one group of people while sending a completely different set of message to another group of people. So this is the kind of thing that social media and digital propaganda allows, which makes it very different from conventional propaganda. If you look at, say, what happened during the Nazi regime in Germany, then through movies, through television channels, through radio broadcasts, there was a lot of propaganda, but it was a common propaganda for the entire population. Everyone heard the same messages, everyone was to be convinced of the same theme. That isn't true of the world that we live in now. Now what political parties want is for every specific group to believe a different message altogether. One caste group will get messages saying that they'll be favored over other groups, while another group is getting messages from the same party that they are going to be favored. Moving on from that, once I realized that okay, political parties are doing this, uh, when we moved to the second book and I worked with Anand Venkat Narayanan on exploring how information warfare works, we realized that a lot of the techniques that are being used in domestic politics are also the same techniques that are used in geopolitics and are used actually by intelligence agencies to wage information war at a country level. The interesting part here is that we realize the world that we live in, power is no longer based on the army that you have or just the amount of money that you have. Power is based on your ability to shape a reality for a population. If you are able to convince a certain section of society that, okay, this is what is true and this is what is fake, you are probably going to have power. Who controls the information that people see? It is these digital platforms. It's Facebook, it's Google, uh, it's Instagram, WhatsApp, all of even the new upcoming platforms that are coming up in India, like ShareChat, like Telegram. They actually have essentially become portals to people's worldview. If someone sends you consistent messages on a theme, it is very difficult for you to go out in the world and experience it for yourself. This is especially true during COVID because most of us are sitting in our house and not actually moving out and interacting with the world. So if we consistently bombard anyone with a certain kind of messaging, that becomes their basis of reality, that becomes their foundation for the worldview. So this is why I think digital propaganda is much more dangerous than mass propaganda, because society is getting more fractured. AI comes into this in two parts. The first part is obviously that AI is a force that is trying to stop this. A lot of the social media companies, a lot of the fact checkers realize that okay, AI is a tool where we can do some amount of sentiment analysis on the content that is being posted on social media. We can track the dissemination of fake links, say, and try to counter it using AI. We can track inauthentic behavior and suspend a lot of the accounts engaging in it using AI. The other part, though, is that the other side is also extremely well funded. You mentioned tech fog. Before this, we saw that a cyber weapon, essentially like Pegasus, was used against, say, journalists and opposition politicians, which cost millions of dollars. So the other side that is engaging in propaganda is also extremely well funded. They also have built a lot of digital tools. The tech fog investigation showed how inauthentic messaging could be amplified and how specific people like journalists could be targeted and bombarded with so much hate speech that it discourages people from speaking out. Very interestingly, so there's this research by Bruce Shire, who's a researcher based out of Harvard, and his entire theory is essentially that any authoritarian regime does not want the population to find out how unpopular the regime is or how popular the critics are. If people realize how unpopular the regime is or how popular some critic is, then people start consolidating. That is when people start coalescing into groups that would oppose a regime. But what any regime would want is that people's dissatisfaction is internal. They must believe that they are the only ones who feel that they are against the regime, while they should see widespread support outside. Their worldview should be okay, everyone supports this man even though I don't, or everyone supports this political party or this regime or this country even though I don't. To do this, a lot of new tools will come up. Tech fog is a tiny example. As the authors of the tech fog investigation even stated, it's not just an app, it's actually an idea, and it is an ecosystem. Uh, Alafia mentioned very correctly that conventional media and social media and all of these platforms come together to create an atmosphere. What we should be discussing now is an ecosystem designed to convince you of a worldview that isn't true, instead of just social media and conventional media and Twitter and Facebook separately, because these things are not separate anymore. Anything that basically dispels your notion of the world through any platform is actually an attack on your information environment. And basically, any regime will try to crack down upon it. The issue that I primarily see with the world right now is that what you are allowed to post on Facebook, what goes viral on Twitter is right now determined by private entities. These private entities decide who's going to get blocked, who is going to get amplified, how the algorithms function, and what messages go viral. This is an incredible power in the modern world. It is the power to shape people's thoughts. And governments are slowly starting to realize that this power is too much for a private entity. So, what you see around the world right now is a fight between governments and these private entities where governments are trying to take back control. It's happening in India. India's brought out a couple of legislations where if a notice for taking down content is sent to the social media platforms, they have to comply. They have to appoint a compliance officer who can actually be arrested for not complying. Other countries around the world, you look at Brazil, you look at a lot of African nations, you look at the United Arab Emirates, you look at China itself, which has its own complete separate internet where there is no encryption. Every country is realizing the value of taking back this control. Why this is problematic is primarily because the government's interest is also in perpetuating whatever party is in power, be it a democracy or be it a non-democratic regime. They will ultimately use the power to shape the information environment to entrench their own self-interest. How we tackle it is a very interesting discussion. I am glad that we finally arrived at the part where we're discussing how to tackle it, because since I've been working on it for the last 5 or 6 years, we've actually just been discussing on the problem and how bleak the scenario is and how bad the things are and how polarization is growing. But I think we are now at that tipping point where people are moving towards discussing solutions.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I'm going to ask that to Alafia. How can we, what's the solution? What is the example from the European example? And Alafia, just before I come to you again, I'm going to go to Karen, but I would like you to also think about this question that Sandeep Khurana has asked about the oversight board in the Q&A box. So Karen, a lot of us take for granted the fire hose of falsehood is pretty obvious to everybody, but I think it's not obvious. So tell me a little bit about what it is like from a strictly a propaganda perspective, what it is like to be at the, to be sitting and, receiving all of this and fact checking everything and so on a daily basis, along with your introductory remarks.
Sure. Thanks, Venkatesh. It's always a pleasure to talk about this subject, which is very close to our hearts. So, I've been in this space since 2017, and my journey sort of coincides with Boom's journey in terms of fighting misinformation and disinformation. And we've seen it evolve from the really harmless stuff that it was in the introductory phase, or I guess we weren't aware, to what it is become. A lot of it overwhelmingly is propaganda. It's extremely prevalent. It has everything to do with how tech is used. I think technology lends itself to being abused, and it's a very potent tool to like some of the things that Shivam said, to personalize a message to a group of people, to reach a lot of people at the same time and do a lot of harm as well. So we've been in this space for quite some time. We are always quite alarmed with everything that happens, and it seems to be like an arms race in terms of the tech. So you have bad actors who will stop at no cost, who have no incentive to self-regulate. There is no regulatory oversight. There is not even a discussion, even though deepfakes have been used and they've been used in elections in India. We've seen an example of this in 2020, where before the Delhi elections, the BJP's Delhi unit created a deep fake of Manoj Tiwari. One was a video where he speaks about Arvind Kejriwal. The other was, I think, a message that was tailor-made to specific WhatsApp groups. But as much as it shocked all fact checkers when that story came out by Vice, nothing after that happened. There wasn't any noise by any politician or even opposition parties to say that, hey, this should not be happening. Even the election commission didn't seem to care, and it just died down. So one is that, when we think of AI and propaganda, the average person thinks of deep fakes, yes, which is very evolved and takes a lot of expertise and money as well. But I guess the daily impact of algorithms and AI and machine learning, what people don't realize is that even the content that these platforms are prioritizing based on machine learning algorithms. So YouTube's algorithm has been criticized because it tends to amplify videos which are violent and shocking. And if you click on one video, the algorithm, I mean, it's almost like this. It's coded into it that, okay, you will, if you click on something, you will like to see similar content. And so it keeps on showing you the same thing. So even all of those things, fall into the category of AI and propaganda.
Right. I'm glad you brought up the Election Commission's quandary in, how to deal with Manoj Tiwari's deep wake. And we are also in election season right now, so we'll probably touch upon the topic. But Alafia, going back to what Shivam said, what has been your experience in how the European Union has led the way in creating a kind of governance infrastructure to rein in, big tech, which, as you pointed out, does not have the incentive to do it on their own?
So two really important themes in the law, and actually articulated in the law, in the Digital Services Act. The first is, to be frank, we don't have a clue as to what's actually happening in the back end of these platforms. I think somebody mentioned, we are unable to look inside the black box. So all of the research is based on a very narrow view of what we are able to research. How are these platforms, algorithmically amplifying disinformation and propaganda? The law, the DSA, enables regulators to look under the hood. So it gives regulators audit powers. And that is one very significant advance from the status quo that we have today. And also, I should say, the DSA is not yet law. It was passed by the European Parliament today, but it still has to be negotiated with the European Commission and the Council, and only then it gets passed. So we're still some ways off from a law actually, being implemented, but these are all really positive signs. So one is audit powers. We can finally look under the hood. The second is a very sophisticated, I think, an elegant solution to this debate that we always end up in, which is, the free speech debate, which is it forces the platforms to do risk assessment. So in the way that a factory or a mine would have to do an environmental risk assessment before it sets up, platforms now routinely have to do a risk assessment as to how their products and policies may be harming people. It is not an obligation they've had to fulfill ever. And because we've sort of emerged from this world of tech utopia where algorithms and AI was going to solve the problems of humanity, everyone had a very rosy view of tech platforms, and this notion of risk assessment or the notion that they could be deeply dangerous to society was never entertained, but it is now enshrined in that piece of legislation which will force the platforms to do risk assessments. So I think those are two really significant advances that, if enshrined in law, will force the platforms to address the problems that they unleash. The other, you touched upon the solutions point briefly earlier, which is that after the US elections, after the January 6th insurrection on Capitol Hill, or rather prior to, not after, but prior to that, the platforms had made a whole bunch of policy changes that essentially slowed down the platform. Even so, they were unsuccessful, but they had introduced a variety of changes. So for example, one was group recommendations. You would not, research from inside Facebook shows that 64% of people in Germany who joined extremist groups did so because of active recommendations by the platforms. Or dangerous features like that were switched off. So there are literally a host of changes that are content neutral that the platforms can make that slow down the spread of disinformation, which they don't because they have no incentive to, they have no pressure to. So I think that's one huge area of solutions. Do you want me to address the point now about the Facebook Oversight Board?
I'll come back to it because I want to bring in Shivam here because you spoke about Shivam about how governments even around the world and even in India is taking cognizance of the problem, but at the same time they don't have an incentive either to change the system that provides them votes, to put it very bluntly. Do you see, let's say, and I want to make a parallel here, the European example, they were leaders in data protection and privacy as well, right? And at that time, we all looked around the landscape and we realized India doesn't have a data protection law. But now we're closer to getting one, pretty close to getting one, right? So from that perspective, do you see any political appetite to bring about regulation of big tech, even though it might go against the incentives of the current government? It's not an easy question, I know, but I'd like your thoughts. And before you answer, Karen, I'm going to come to you next and talk about election season and what happens specifically in election season, so that you have a little bit of time to get your thoughts in order. Shivam?
So first, I'd like to start by saying that I never meant that the government will try and fix the problem. I only meant that they realize how powerful the social media giants are, and they will want to take some of that power to themselves. And essentially, that is what I see a lot of the regulation in India being framed as. It's not to fix the problem of disinformation. It's not to fix the problem of fake news. It's to make the government the arbiter of what should be on a platform and what should be taken down and what should be going viral. So that is completely in line with the government's incentive. That is completely in line with the political party's incentive structure, where they get the power and control. As you mentioned, data protection, it is a very important component of it, because if you look at digital propaganda, a major component of it is actually profiling people. Facebook is a brilliant tool because it already allows you to profile people based on their likes, based on their activity on the platform itself. But a lot of the profiling is done by political parties themselves. They do it using the voter roll, just by using people's last name, just by using proxies like people's electricity bills that give you an idea of people's socioeconomic status. Because if you have a higher bill, then you probably have a bigger house with more appliances, so you are richer, that kind of a thing. So right now, because we don't have a data protection law, things like people's phone numbers, things like people's electricity bills, even things like people's enrollment as beneficiaries of government schemes are not protected under any law. What is protected is medical data and passwords and financial data under the IT Act, but that's about it, very minor component. Because all of the other data is publicly available, it gets linked to phone numbers relatively easily. Then these phone numbers are used to send you WhatsApp messages, to send you phone calls and IVRS messages and SMS. These phone numbers and email addresses can also be then used to target you on the social media platforms. So Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp all allow you to target people based on their phone numbers and their email IDs. Just doing things like this, you essentially create a model where, okay, I want to send one particular set of people a particular message, I can now do it. So data protection does stop some of it. The issue now is that a lot of this data is already in private hands. We discussed, I remember Venkatesh and I talked when the second book came out, WhatsApp essentially changed its policies on how groups could not be created in bulk in 2018. And right now, if you try to create 5 or 10 WhatsApp groups from one SIM card, your SIM number is going to get blocked. So bulk creation without massive SIM churning is very difficult. But the issue is that BJP started creating these groups in 2012, 2013, and all of those WhatsApp groups still exist. So essentially, the 2018 change in policy locked in BJP's competitive advantage on WhatsApp. So things like this is an unintended consequence. Obviously, WhatsApp did not want one political party to essentially freeze its advantage on their platform, but it did happen because of a policy change. And these kind of things with data protection law coming in are also going to happen because there are entities who already scraped a lot of data, who already have a lot of people profiled. How do you get this deleted is an important question that needs to be addressed.
Right. Yeah, more questions, fewer answers, but that's the way we like it because, this conversation will also lead to work down the line. Karen, election season is here. 5 years ago, it was the turn of UP, and again, it's the term of UP. That's when we see a lot of misinformation. Along the way, we've seen plenty of other elections. So, does propaganda change very significantly as election season comes closer, or is it like pretty much the same? If you were to draw a graph.
No, it definitely picks up during election season. It's game time for all political parties, and sadly, propaganda and the dark arts is become an accepted part of nearly all election. All parties that we see during elections become extremely active on social media in terms of pushing out their own message or in terms of targeting the opposition party. So yes, it's been a busy time because UP is around, UP elections and the other state elections, the other elections in the 4 states are around the corner. We are primarily focused on Uttar Pradesh. It's a huge state. It sends a lot of legislators to the parliament, so it's important. From last time, the difference that we've seen is that the other parties, the SP and the BSP, they've gotten a lot more active. They've upped their social media game. I guess they've realized that if you want to take on the BJP, then you have to play their game as well. So we see a lot, prior to the 6 months prior, I think even before that, almost like a year before that, we started seeing the SP create a lot of Facebook pages, that were basically putting out the message of the party and creating a lot of pages for the local leaders. But you do in terms of what we see during elections, it's everything. It's speeches, it's videos of probably empty grounds to show that nobody attended this particular politician's speech, or it's Photoshop pictures, it's pictures used out of context, it's old pictures saying this is what UP looked like when SP was in power. Now this is what it looks like when BJP is in power, or old videos of police crackdowns, that have nothing to do with current times, and they're shared as recent. So out of every, I think, 5 stories that we might be doing every single day, 4 are about the elections. And one of the most I think persistent fake messages that have been doing the rounds with regards to UP was that there's a Facebook post which says Akhilesh Yadav was one of the 302 petitioners which signed, who lent his name to the mercy petition for Ajmal Kasab. Now that is completely false. My colleague Sumit, in fact, spoke to the lawyer who wrote that petition, and he said, I've been getting calls from journalists, and I don't know how many times I have to say this, but it's completely false. So stuff like that. Everything from I guess these parties are only limited by imagination, but because it's elections and there's everything to lose and everything to win, they go all out during this period.
Yeah, that was quite illuminating and frightening. Alafia, I wonder if you can talk about Facebook's role on this, especially, I was listening to a podcast in which Frances Haugen was speaking to, well, I forgot, she's the former editor of Recode, who now has a podcast on New York Times. Essentially she was saying that the problem is ad rates on Facebook. It's not the same for all political parties. And it's decided by some algorithm, AI-driven, all algorithms are, I guess, AI-driven. So apparently divisive content is about 10 times cheaper to pay for than a loving or a compassionate message. So there is that aspect as well. Ad rates, and we don't know, it's a huge black box in India as well about political ads on Facebook here. So can you talk about what's going on there in terms of fighting for parity, or at least ensuring that political ads don't get so much of a leg up from platforms?
I think that when I heard her say that was one of the more shocking revelations for me, that it's actually cheaper to spread hate. Not just that it wins you votes, it's actually much cheaper as well. I think you're back in that loop of, is that what society really is? As in, like, hate sells not just because it's cheap, but actually people want that, and therefore it's cheap. I think one of the bigger problems, though, in the advertising space is the loophole that Facebook created around not fact-checking ads. So that fact-checking blanket exemption on advertising, particularly when it came from like politicians, I think that is absolutely unjustifiable. And that, I think, more than the cheapness of the ad and the problem of narrowcasting, both of which are huge problems, the fact that you can post anything, the fact that it has to pass no fact-checking standards if it comes from political parties, and they hadn't defined whether that meant like some new candidate or an established political party. What does that even, like, whose ad is considered political? I think that was one of the huge gaps in that enabled further spread of disinformation and hate. So I'd say that is a huge loophole that Facebook, I don't recall if they've already plugged it, but that enabled a much bigger spread of disinformation.
Okay, before I come to you, Shivam, Alafa, can you also comment on the FB Oversight Board? And the question specifically is from Sandeep Khurana, which is, let me just read. Do you think the Oversight Board to look into complaints against content moderation have the desired governance structure to elicit trust, and how they can be made more effective? So that's part of the question.
So the Oversight Board, first and foremost, is still self-regulation. And self-regulation, we know, has failed because the platforms don't have the incentives to change their behavior. The second huge problem with the Oversight Board is that they look at individual pieces of content, which is like looking for the needle in the haystack. The Oversight Board does not have the power to demand the kind of data access that I spoke about earlier, which hopefully will be enshrined in law, which is to look at how are your algorithms actually promoting X and Y pieces of content. So by looking at individual pieces of content, it is utterly pointless. And so it is this big grand institution set up to do very little, to look at a very narrow aspect of the problem, and it is still self-regulation. But I just want to add one more point, which goes to, I think, one of the questions in the chat around, like, okay, regulation's all very well, but when the government is part of the problem, what is the use of regulation? And I totally agree with that. There are some governments who you don't want legislating and interfering in, like, content moderation questions. You're still, however, left with the problem that it is private entities regulating speech and thought. I'm not quite sure what you do about that, but that's where I think at least an entity like the Oversight Board presents some option of a redress mechanism, but caveat all of its failures, which is it looks too narrowly and it is still self-regulation.
Got it. I want to do a quick time check. It's 2:45. We have 15 minutes left, and we'll try and answer all questions, but there are some questions I won't take because I don't think it was meant. It's for this panel. We could have got to it in the earlier panels, but obviously time is a factor. Shivam, there's a question again from Sandeep. How much should autonomous institutions be held accountable on the failure to control disinformation? I'd add propaganda to it. The Election Commission, Press Council. I mean, we already know the answer to it, I suppose, but it will be good to hear your perspective.
So what we noticed before the 2019 election is that the Election Commission could actually have done absolutely nothing. They announced that they would be looking at propaganda and misinformation on social media. And they actually did try to formulate teams who would do some amount of content monitoring. But the issue is the content is just too vast. And political parties are actually exceptionally well staffed. They would easily flood the Election Commission with complaints against the other side if the mechanism was even slightly effective. And then the mechanism would have thousands of complaints flooding in every day from both political sides against each other. In a situation like that, any amount of content moderation by the Election Commission is not going to be feasible. No team is big enough. So I don't think that's a solution at all. When you look at propaganda on television, then yes, definitely a lot more should be done. When you look at hate speech on television, a lot more should be done, because that is actually not that many television channels. It's not that many TV debates. It's not difficult to prove that something was fake news. It's not difficult to prove that something was hate speech. And we haven't even been able to have the will to correct that. It's happening right now, and the Election Commission is not acting on that. So I think that is the point to start rather than social media.
Okay, yeah, fair point. Karen, do you have anything to add to the whole idea of, not just election, not just the fact that the Election Commission and the other institutions are not going to be able to do this, but also they're pretty toothless in other times as well. I think it looks like we've lost Karen for the moment. Okay, Alafia, I'm going to take this conversation in a slightly related direction, which is from your perspective as someone who seeks to hold big tech accountable. We know pretty much that you work with the European Union and the geography there. But what about what you see in the United States? The United States has a completely different approach, it seems like, when it comes to regulating tech. And what do you see in terms of India as well? Do you see India and maybe other countries also heading in a different direction? Are there many views, or do you see signs of everybody converging towards one view of holding big tech accountable?
I think what is interesting, like particularly in the United States, is that both Democrats and Republicans want to hold big tech accountable, but for very different reasons. And so it is the spirit of why they want to hold big tech accountable. That's where it breaks down very quickly. Conservatives have this false imagined notion that they're being censored when all of the evidence actually suggests that their content gets massively amplified. And Democrats feel that they are being censored because it's the conservative content that gets amplified. I think one of the genuine concerns in holding big tech accountable is that we end up potentially, I think we're already heading in that direction of a kind of splinter net. Where countries want to create walled gardens and wall off their internet so that they can control the information ecosystem within their sovereign borders. So I think that is a genuine worry, and the original promise of the internet as a sort of global unifying force, I think that breaks down when you have that sort of direction of travel. I think however, having said that, like one promise of regulation of big tech from, let's say, somewhere like the European Union, which might, fingers crossed, be the first to actually pass regulation that governs particularly issues of content moderation that heavily impact, civil society surveys from Brazil, India, Kenya, Nigeria, like the content moderation aspect of big tech is one of the things that really exercises civil society in those countries. So I think one of the promises of regulation is that even if, we kind of don't want India to be regulating the content moderation space, or we may not want the Nigerian government to be doing so, civil society can demand some of the protections enshrined in law that platforms will then have to reflect back in their terms and conditions in other parts of the world as well. So it gives civil society a basis to demand more. So for example, one of the things that, like, I remember this was a real topic of discussion when Facebook said they would not allow white supremacy. There was a real debate around what other kinds of supremacist content should be taken off the platform. That was a debate enabled by the fact that Facebook finally went ahead and banned white supremacist content. How effectively they actually do it is a whole other matter, but it was reflected in their policies. So I think that's one of the promises of regulation, which is not that we want every other country to actually regulate, but you can start to demand the same sorts of protections that platforms give other people in countries where there is robust regulation.
So you see those trends, as you hinted, of course, in India and other countries as well?
I certainly see it from civil society. So to give you an example, actually, just last evening, a group of civil society organizations released a letter along with two Facebook whistleblowers, Sophie Zhang and Frances Haugen, demanding that Facebook release its human rights impact assessment. They have done this before in Myanmar and had to reflect policy changes. They have done an HRIA in Sri Lanka. I don't know if they've actually reflected any policy changes, but India, their biggest market, where we know that they are complicit in perpetrating violence on the ground, amplifying hate. They've been sitting on an HRIA for 2 years, which they commissioned through a law firm called Foley Hogue. There's no sign of that. And if it is enshrined in law that they have to do these risk assessments and HRIAs, civil society elsewhere can start to demand that you do those in every country where these platforms don't just have the ambition to be social media, they want to be the internet. And so that must come with greater responsibility.
Yeah, interesting. I think we're going to try and close out with final comments. Karen is also back, it looks like. Karen, I want to ask you, what is your wish list as a practitioner of someone who fights disinformation on a daily basis? What would you like to have from technology, big tech specifically, but also all these technology plays that come up and are trying to solve it with technology? We've seen that with Silicon Valley. For every problem, they'll say, okay, the solution is also technology, right? So we'll build this other machine, or we'll build this other thing that is going to, it's kind of funny when you think about it, and it's not funny as well in another sense. So Karen, what is your wish list?
So, I look at misinformation and disinformation as you would look at like a chronic disease problem, and I see fact checking as the medicine, but that doesn't, lead to good health. What leads to good health are other things. For example, and this is where I see the role of, good journalism, a strong judiciary, and readers that, I don't think we should leave it up to the governments and the big tech company, because you're right. Their solution to everything is to throw more tech at it. And that may not always be the best idea, but what we can do is ensure that outlets that are doing good journalism, that they are supported, that they are funded, that they don't have to struggle to get their work out. The other thing is the judiciary. I think personally, I've been disappointed that from the message that's come from the judiciary in terms of support to reporters and journalistic outlets, and in terms of a lot of places where I feel they could have spoken up and held people accountable. They've been ominously silent, and I think it hurts all of us. So unless you have those two pillars that are strengthened, it makes no sense that a small group of fact checkers are expected to tackle the entire problem of misinformation. till that point, it will just be producing fact checks endlessly, and it won't make a dent at all in this ecosystem.
Yeah, yeah. Kind of grim note on which to end. Shivam, I'll come to you, and then Alafia to you for closing comments. But I also want to flag this for Sahana. Sahana, it's just interesting that we've spoken about the role of big tech. We've spoken about the need for governance. So we have policy. We also have the civil society example. So when I come to you, and maybe you can close it out on this, I want to check if universities and research institutions are up to the task of doing their bit as well. So I'll come to you in a moment. But Shivam, last remarks on this topic of AI and propaganda and what you see forthcoming in India and other countries, and then Alafia, and then finally Sahana.
So absolutely agreed with Karen that strong societal institutions, a strong judiciary, a strong media, a strong educational setup that also focuses on value-based education is all important components that will help society weather the storm of disinformation and fake news. But I also feel that there are other solutions that will come about together. A major part of it is based around algorithms. If you look at the EU, then definitely. But if you look at the case of China, it's actually very interesting what they're trying to do. They are essentially trying to not regulate speech. They're trying to regulate the virality of speech. And the entire idea is that the algorithms will suppress virality altogether. So what you do is that you only get to talk to small groups using social media. And it is like the social media that we had during MySpace and the founding of Facebook, where you only talk to your friends. You did not talk to unknown people and amplify your content throughout the world. The second part that they're doing is that they're giving people more control over what tags are attached to them. Why do I see a particular video on YouTube? Why do I see a particular post on Facebook? It's because Facebook or Google have attached a specific keyword to me. Right now, I don't get to see what those keywords are. There are legislations being proposed where you can see those keywords and be able to delete them and change them. So these kind of technological solutions will come about. The third component that I see as a major solution is actually ultimately the other side that is trying to counter all of the disinformation becoming so powerful that they are able to spread their message more and reach more people. Once a critical mass is reached where fact checks reach enough people, where information about disinformation reaches enough people, the impact and the value of spreading propaganda will decline. So these three things.
Okay, another wish list there. So, and Alafia, final comments. Actually, you know what? Because you're a former television journalist, I'll ask you a very television question, which is, are you optimistic?
I am a realist. I'm a realist optimist. Yes, I think I have to be optimistic. Otherwise, I'll just want to go back to bed, get under a blanket, and never emerge because I think the scale of the problem is so huge. But I remain an optimist in the sense that, I really want to see how regulation might rein in these platforms. And if it does, that is then we finally have a case of the state in which we, the people, vest power, taking back control from the big tech platforms. So I remain optimistic. What I worry about is, I came to this work, I'm not a technologist. So I came to this work in the way that you do, where if you're doing human rights work, it's just a matter of time before you bump up against oppression in the digital space. So that's how I came to this work. And the thing that I worry about is being blindsided by new technologies that I, as a technologist, just have no idea what the next whiz-bang thing will be that some dude somewhere in a basement thinks is a great idea to unleash on the world. So that's the aspect of it that I worry about. But I feel like if we have enough of an awareness in society where data rights are human rights, where digital rights are human rights, then we can start to demand change. And I agree with what the previous panelists have said. I think there is just no way to not do this as a whole of society effort, which will involve every other institutional reform.
Yeah. The metaverse is coming. So some people in a basement have already dreamed that up. Sahana, final comments, and maybe you can also close out this session. What do you think, research institutes, universities, are they all getting it right in terms of collaboration? I speak, of course, about your own initiative, AI4Dignity, but that's really just one example, right? One bright spot.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think there is no need for any closing note because Alafia has so elegantly summarized the crisis and also voicing the hope that perhaps with broader and more sensible regulation, we are able to catch up with technological innovation for bad purposes. So I would stay with what Alafia has elegantly summarized. And in fact, I have several more questions to Alafia, but perhaps this is not the time. Just to close off, I think there are 2 or 3 points that need to be kept in mind. One is the trend towards controlling digital ecosystems within sovereign borders. And Alafia brought this up and she talked about Splinternet. And of course, we've been talking about China for a very long time, but we also see that trend emerging in other countries. And domestic platforms are now being privileged because they are complying with repressive regulations more readily than global tech. So it's a very weird situation where we are actually looking to global tech moderation practices as a sort of hope to contain repressive actions that are actually going on in direct complicity with emerging domestic platforms. So that's one area that's emerging. So when we talk about artificial intelligence for good, I think civil society voice should be very strong in terms of engaging these new platforms and domestic enterprise that's also shaping this space in a very interesting and also disturbing way. And of course, I would completely support what Alafia has brought up in terms of parity in platform governance. So on the one hand, we see that the EU regime has really pushed for rigorous, robust regulatory framework in terms of risk assessments and also recommendation systems, advertising, trusted flaggers, notices, whatnot. If you see Digital Services Act, it's just amazing, right? But do we have similar protections in other countries, especially where governmental intentions are not clear or disturbing, right? So that's a huge challenge that we need to be bracing up for. And Shivam, of course, he's so right when he says political parties are instrumentalizing them. And we need to watch out this space, especially for how different political parties will lay their claim more and more. And perhaps in a very weird way, that a multi-party system will create some balance in this queue, right? So perhaps, that's a very weird way of, what we call cruel optimism. So let us, with that optimistic note, I think I will turn Venkatesh's grim note into some kind of optimistic note. And thank you so much. And I have nothing more to say. And thank you, Venkatesh, Govindraj, and Boom for partnering with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for LMU Munich, Professor. And also thanks very much. One thing I would like to say is that a lot of advances in this space happen because of collaboration, and collaboration happens because you get connected to each other. So in that spirit, if anyone wants to reach anybody, please write into us. We'll connect you for sure. I have no doubt that people want to be connected here and learn more from each other. And so we leave it at that. Also, thanks so much to all the people from the fact-checking, research, policy space for joining in. And thank you to people from universities for joining in as well. And you can also write in here. Please check out AI4Dignity by LMU Munich and write into us for any feedback or thoughts, or if you want to be connected to someone. Thank you so much. Right. I think we're done. And once